Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the autumn of 2023, deep in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area wilderness of northern Minnesota, near the Canadian border. What started as a peaceful camping trip with my boyfriend Mark and our two college friends, Jessica and Tom, became something that still haunts my dreams. We'd planned this trip for months, a long weekend escape from our demanding jobs in Minneapolis. Mark, always the outdoorsman, had insisted on choosing a remote campsite on Basswood Lake, accessible only by canoe after a grueling portage. The farther from civilization, the better, he'd said with that confident grin that made me fall for him 3 years ago. The drive north had been filled with laughter and anticipation. Jessica, a graphic designer with an infectious laugh, kept us entertained with stories from her latest dating disasters. Tom, quiet and methodical as always, studied our maps and GPS readings like they were sacred texts. Mark drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on my knee as pine forests blurred past our windows. We launched our canoes at the Moose Lake entry point around noon, the October air crisp with the promise of winter. The trees were spectacular, a riot of gold, crimson and orange that reflected perfectly in the still water. For the first few hours, everything was perfect. The rhythm of paddling, the occasional call of a loon, the vast silence broken only by the gentle splash of our paddles. It was Tom who first noticed something odd. We'd stopped at a small island to stretch our legs and check our position when he frowned at his GPS unit. "That's weird," he muttered, tapping the screen. "This thing says we're about 2 miles southeast of where we should be." Mark laughed it off. "Technology, right? That's why I brought paper maps." But when he unfolded our topographical map, his expression changed. The waterways didn't match what we were seeing. According to the map, there should have been a large bay to our north. Instead, we saw only dense forest. "Must be an old map," Jessica said, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "These wilderness areas change all the time, right? Beaver dams, erosion." We pressed on, following what appeared to be the main channel toward our planned campsite. The sun was getting lower, casting long shadows across the water, and we needed to set up camp before dark. But as we paddled deeper into the wilderness, the landscape seemed to shift around us in subtle, unsettling ways. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead to block out more and more of the sky. The water beneath our canoes turned from clear blue to a murky brown-green that made it impossible to see the bottom. Most disturbing of all, the silence deepened until even our paddle strokes seemed muffled and distant. When we finally found a suitable campsite, a small clearing on a rocky point, the sun was already touching the horizon. We worked quickly to set up our tents and gather firewood, everyone feeling the urgency of approaching darkness in the wilderness. That's when we met Ezra. He emerged from the tree line as we were arranging stones for our fire pit, moving with the quiet confidence of someone completely at home in the wilderness. He appeared to be in his 60s, with long gray hair tied back and clothing that looked handmade, all leather and rough-woven cloth. But it was his eyes that unsettled me, pale blue, almost colorless, and far too knowing. "Evening, folks," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "Beautiful spot you've chosen. Not many people find their way to this particular piece of water." Mark, ever friendly, introduced us and invited Ezra to share our fire. The old man accepted with a smile that didn't reach those strange eyes. "Been living out here for, must be going on 15 years now," Ezra said as we cooked our simple dinner of canned soup and camp bread. "Built myself a little cabin about 2 miles north. Don't get much company, especially this late in the season." 15 years? Jessica asked. "Don't you get lonely?" Ezra's smile widened, showing teeth that seemed too sharp. Lonely? No, miss. These woods are full of company. You just have to know how to listen. As if on cue, a sound drifted through the trees, something between a whistle and a moan, rising and falling like wind through hollow bones. We all looked up, but Ezra just nodded approvingly. "They're welcoming you," he said. "The old ones. They don't usually take to strangers, but they seem to like your group." Tom shifted uncomfortably. "What kind of wildlife is out here? Bears? Wolves?" "Oh, there's all manner of creatures in these woods," Ezra replied. "Some you'd recognize, some you wouldn't. The trick is knowing which ones to fear and which ones to accommodate." The conversation continued, but I found myself only half listening. Something about Ezra bothered me on a level I couldn't articulate. Maybe it was the way he never seemed to blink, or how his gaze lingered too long on each of us, as if he were memorizing our faces. Or perhaps it was how the shadows seemed to gather around him even in the firelight. When he finally left, melting back into the darkness as silently as he'd appeared, I felt a wave of relief. But Mark seemed energized by the encounter. "How cool is that?" he said as we prepared for bed. "A real hermit. I bet he's got amazing stories." "He gave me the creeps," I admitted, checking the zippers on our tent for the third time. "Come on, Sarah. He's just an old guy who chose a different lifestyle. I think it's admirable." I wanted to argue, but fatigue was overwhelming me. We'd been paddling for hours, and the fresh air had left us all exhausted. Within minutes of crawling into our sleeping bags, I could hear Tom's snores from the adjacent tent. Sleep came quickly, but it was far from restful. I dreamed of walking through an endless forest where the trees had faces, twisted, agonized expressions carved into bark that wept sap like tears. Voices whispered my name from every direction, but when I turned to look, I saw only shadows slipping between the trunks. The ground beneath my feet felt soft and yielding, and I realized with growing horror that I was walking on a carpet of bones, human bones, bleached white and partially buried in the forest floor. I woke, gasping, my heart hammering against my ribs. The tent was suffocatingly dark, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was. Then Mark's steady breathing beside me brought me back to reality. Just a nightmare, brought on by too much camp coffee and that unsettling encounter with Ezra. But as I lay there trying to calm my racing pulse, I became aware of sounds outside our tent. Soft footsteps circling our campsite, so quiet they might have been imagined. The gentle rustling of someone, or something, moving through our supplies. I held my breath and listened. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of a zipper being slowly opened. Our food pack, hanging from a rope between two trees to keep it away from bears. "Mark," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Mark, wake up." He mumbled something incoherent and rolled over. Outside, the footsteps had stopped, but I could feel a presence just beyond the thin nylon wall of our tent. Something was standing there, breathing, waiting. I must have fallen asleep again because the next thing I knew, pale morning light was filtering through the tent fabric. Mark was already up, and I could hear voices outside, Jessica and Tom discussing breakfast plans. When I emerged from the tent, everything looked normal. Our food pack was still hanging where we'd left it, apparently untouched. But something felt wrong, and it took me several minutes to figure out what it was. The silence. The forest, which had been alive with birdsong when we'd arrived, was now completely quiet. No insects buzzing, no squirrels chattering, no distant loon calls across the water. Just an oppressive, unnatural silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. "Anyone else notice how quiet it is?" I asked as we prepared a simple breakfast of oatmeal and coffee. Tom looked up from adjusting his camera settings. He'd been our designated trip photographer, documenting every aspect of our wilderness adventure. "Now that you mention it, yeah, it's kind of eerie." "Probably just means bad weather coming," Mark said, though he kept glancing at the clear blue sky above. "Animals can sense these things before we can." We spent the morning exploring the immediate area, taking photos and enjoying the stunning fall colors. But the unnatural quiet persisted, and I noticed other small things that added to my growing unease. Our compass seemed to spin randomly, never settling on a consistent direction. The GPS units, both Tom's handheld device and the app on our phones, showed different locations each time we checked them, as if we were somehow moving even while standing still. Most disturbing were the trees themselves. I'm not an expert on forest ecology, but I grew up in rural Minnesota, and I knew these woods well enough to recognize the common species. What I was seeing didn't make sense. Ancient white pines towered next to tropical-looking plants I'd never seen before. Some trees appeared to be growing in impossible configurations, their trunks twisted into spirals or their branches forming perfect geometric patterns. "Look at this," Jessica called from a small clearing about 50 yards from our campsite. When we joined her, she was standing beside what looked like a fairy ring, a perfect circle of mushrooms about 10 feet in diameter. But these weren't ordinary mushrooms. They were massive, some standing nearly 3 feet tall, with caps that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. "I've never seen anything like this," Tom said, raising his camera. But when he pressed the shutter, nothing happened. He checked the battery display, full charge, and tried again. The camera remained stubbornly inactive. "Technology problems seem to be going around," I muttered, pulling out my phone to try for a photo. The screen was black, completely unresponsive despite showing full battery when I'd checked it that morning. That afternoon, Ezra returned. He appeared as we were preparing lunch, stepping out of the forest with that same unnatural quiet. This time, however, I noticed something I'd missed the night before. He cast no shadow. Despite the bright afternoon sun, Ezra moved across the clearing without creating so much as a hint of darkness on the ground. "Beautiful day," he said, settling himself on a fallen log as if he'd been invited. "Perfect for exploring. Have you folks had a chance to see much of the area?" "We found an incredible mushroom circle about a quarter-mile from here," Jessica said, her natural friendliness overriding any concerns about our uninvited guest. "I've never seen fungi that size." Ezra's smile widened, showing those 2 sharp teeth. "Ah, you found the old ring. That's been there longer than anyone can remember. Local legend says it's where the boundary grows thin." "Boundary?" Mark asked. "Between here and elsewhere, between what is and what might be. The native peoples who lived here before the Europeans arrived knew about such places. They avoided them, for the most part, showed proper respect." A chill ran down my spine despite the warm afternoon sun. "What kind of respect?" "Offerings. Mostly. Small things. Food, trinkets, sometimes." His pale eyes fixed on me with uncomfortable intensity. "Sometimes more significant gifts." Tom, who'd been quietly fiddling with his broken camera, looked up sharply. "What do you mean by significant gifts?" Ezra shrugged. "The old ways required balance. Take something from the forest, you give something back. The early settlers didn't understand this. Lost a lot of people before they learned to show proper respect." "Lost people how?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. "Missing," Ezra said simply. "Vanished without a trace. The search parties would find their camps undisturbed, food still cooking over the fire, but no sign of the people themselves. Course, sometimes they'd come back. Come back. Changed, different, not quite right anymore." His gaze moved from face to face, studying our reactions. "The forest has its own way of claiming what it wants." An uncomfortable silence settled over our group. Even Mark, usually quick with a joke or a rational explanation, seemed at a loss for words. "Well," Ezra said finally, standing with fluid grace, "I should let you folks get back to your vacation. Just remember what I said about respect. These old places have long memories." He was halfway to the tree line when he paused and looked back. "Oh, and you might want to stay close to your fire tonight. Sometimes the darkness out here gets hungry." This time, I watched him carefully as he walked away. His footsteps made no sound on the leaf-covered ground, and where he passed, the already dim plant life seemed to wither and darken. "Okay, that guy is seriously creeping me out," Jessica said once he was out of earshot. "He's harmless," Mark insisted, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Just eccentric. Living alone out here for 15 years would make anyone a little weird." "I don't think he's harmless," I said quietly. "There's something wrong about him. Something off." Tom nodded agreement. "Did anyone else notice he doesn't cast a shadow?" We all looked at each other. None of us had wanted to be the first to voice that particular observation, but now that it was out in the open, the implications hung heavily in the air. "Maybe we should consider leaving early," I suggested. "Cut the trip short, head back tomorrow morning." "Because of some eccentric old hermit?" Mark's tone was dismissive, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "Come on, we drove 6 hours to get here. Let's at least give it the full weekend." But as evening approached, the atmosphere around our campsite grew increasingly oppressive. The unnatural silence persisted, broken only by occasional sounds that didn't belong, whispers that might have been wind through leaves, footsteps that stopped whenever we tried to locate their source, and that strange whistling moan we'd heard the night before. Our fire, which had burned bright and steady the previous evening, now guttered and flickered despite the still air. Twice it went out completely for no apparent reason, leaving us in absolute darkness before Mark managed to relight it with increasingly difficulty. "This wood must be damp," he muttered after the third time, but we all knew the kindling was bone dry. Dinner was a subdued affair. None of us had much appetite, and conversation was stilted and forced. As darkness fell, we found ourselves huddling closer to the unreliable fire, each lost in our own uneasy thoughts. It was Jessica who first noticed that Tom was missing. "Where did he go?" she asked, looking around our small circle. I'd been so focused on keeping the fire going that I hadn't noticed his absence. "Bathroom break," Mark suggested, but we all knew Tom was meticulous about announcing his intentions, especially at night in unfamiliar wilderness. "Tom," I called out. "Tom, where are you?" Silence. We searched the immediate area with our flashlights, calling his name and growing increasingly frantic. His tent was empty, his sleeping bag still laid out but cold to the touch. His pack remained with all his gear, including his wallet and car keys. "He wouldn't just wander off," Jessica said, her voice tight with worry. "Not without telling us. Not without his flashlight." We expanded our search, moving farther from the campsite despite our growing fear. The forest felt malevolent in the darkness, full of shadows that moved independently of our flashlight beams and sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was nearly midnight when we found him. Tom was standing in the mushroom circle we discovered that afternoon, perfectly motionless in the center of the ring. His back was to us, and he didn't respond when we called his name. "Tom?" Mark approached cautiously, his flashlight beam fixed on our friend's still form. "Tom, are you okay?" When Tom finally turned around, I had to stifle a scream. It was Tom's face, but somehow wrong. His features were subtly distorted, as if someone had tried to reconstruct them from memory. His eyes were too wide, his smile too broad, and when he spoke, his voice carried an odd, hollow quality. "Hello, friends," he said, tilting his head at an unnatural angle. "I was just exploring." "We've been looking everywhere for you," Jessica said, relief and confusion warring in her voice. "You scared us half to death." "Did I?" Tom's smile grew wider, stretching his features in ways that human faces weren't meant to stretch. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cause concern." Something was very, very wrong. The Tom I knew would have been full of apologies, explaining where he'd been and why he'd left without saying anything. This thing wearing Tom's face spoke with careful, deliberate pauses, as if it were translating thoughts from another language. "Come on," Mark said, clearly as unsettled as the rest of us. "Let's get back to camp." Tom nodded agreeably and followed us back to the fire. But throughout the return journey, I caught glimpses of him in my peripheral vision that made my skin crawl. His movements were too fluid, too graceful. His feet made no sound on the forest floor. And once, when I glanced back directly, I could have sworn I saw his shadow moving independently of his body. Back at the campsite, Tom settled himself beside the fire and stared into the flames with unblinking intensity. He didn't speak unless directly addressed, and when he did respond, his answers were brief and strangely formal. "I think we should leave first thing in the morning," I whispered to Mark when we retreated to our tent. "I'm starting to agree with you," he admitted. "Something's not right about any of this. The broken electronics, that weird old guy, and now Tom acting like he's had some kind of breakdown." But Tom wasn't having a breakdown. Tom wasn't Tom anymore. I knew this with the same instinctive certainty that tells you when someone is watching you in the dark. Whatever had come back from that mushroom circle was wearing my friend's face like a mask, and it was wearing it imperfectly. Sleep was impossible. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the sounds outside our tent, the crackling of our dying fire, Jessica's restless movements in the adjacent tent, and underneath it all, a soft humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. Around 3 in the morning, I heard Tom's voice. He was talking to someone outside the tents, his voice low and conversational. I couldn't make out the words, but the rhythm was wrong. Too many pauses, responses to questions no one else had asked. I nudged Mark awake and pressed my finger to my lips when he started to speak. Together, we listened to Tom's one-sided conversation, growing more disturbed by the minute. "Yes," Tom said clearly at one point. "Yes, I understand. 3 more. The woman, first, I think. She suspects." My blood turned to ice. Mark's hand found mine in the darkness, his palm slick with sweat. "Tomorrow night," Tom continued, "when the moon is dark. Yes, I'll bring them to the circle." The conversation continued for several more minutes before falling silent. We waited, hardly daring to breathe, until we heard the soft sound of Tom's tent zipper being opened and closed. "We're leaving right now," Mark whispered, his lips against my ear. "Wake Jessica. We'll take the canoes and paddle out in the dark." But when we crept out of our tent, we found our canoes had been dragged far up onto the shore and partially concealed under fallen branches. It would take time to free them and get them back to the water, time we might not have if Tom realized what we were doing. Jessica was awake when we reached her tent, her eyes wide with fear. "I heard him talking," she whispered. "Who was he talking to?" "We don't know," Mark replied, "but we're getting out of here right now." We worked as quietly as possible to gather our essential gear: water, some food, our flashlights. Everything else would have to be abandoned. The canoes were our priority. It took nearly an hour to clear the branches and drag the boats back to the water. Every small sound seemed amplified in the pre-dawn silence, and I kept expecting to see Tom emerge from his tent to investigate. But his campsite remained quiet and still. We were loading the last of our gear when Jessica noticed something that made her gasp. "Look at Tom's tent," she whispered. I followed her gaze and felt my stomach drop. Tom's tent was glowing softly from within, pulsing with the same sick light we'd seen from the mushrooms in the fairy ring. And silhouetted against the fabric was a shape that was decidedly not human, something tall and angular, with too many joints and appendages that moved like boneless tentacles. "Go," Mark hissed. "Go now." We launched the canoes as quietly as possible and began paddling away from shore. Behind us, the glow from Tom's tent was growing brighter, and I could hear sounds emerging from it that no human throat could make, wet, chittering noises punctuated by something that might have been laughter. We'd made it perhaps 100 yards from shore when the thing that had been wearing Tom's face emerged from the tent. In the growing light of dawn, its true form was horrifyingly visible. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, with limbs that bent in impossible directions and skin that seemed to shift and flow like liquid. Its face, Tom's face, was stretched across a skull that was far too large, the features distorted beyond recognition. It saw us immediately and let out a sound that was part scream, part roar, and entirely inhuman. Then it began to move toward the water with a lurching, spider-like gait that covered ground with terrifying speed. "Paddle!" Mark shouted, abandoning any attempt at stealth. "Paddle harder!" We dug our paddles into the water with desperate strength, but the creature reached the shore's edge before we'd gained much distance. For a terrible moment, I thought it might follow us into the water. Instead, it stood at the waterline and opened its mouth, Tom's mouth, impossibly wide. The sound that emerged was like nothing I'd ever heard. It was Tom's voice, but multiplied and distorted, as if dozens of Toms were screaming in unison. The sound rolled across the water and seemed to come from every direction at once, disorienting and nauseating. But worse than the sound was what it did to the water around us. The lake began to change. The dark water turned viscous and oily, clinging to our paddles and making each stroke an exhausting effort. Things moved beneath the surface, large shapes that bumped against our canoes from below and sent ripples across what had become more swamp than lake. "The map!" Jessica called out from her canoe, which was now several yards ahead of ours. "Look at the map!" Mark fumbled for our waterproof map case while I continued paddling. When he unfolded the topographical map, he swore loudly. The waterways had changed completely. Where before we'd seen a complex network of lakes and streams leading back to our entry point, now the map showed only a single, winding channel that seemed to go on forever. And at the center of the map, where our current location should have been, was a symbol I didn't recognize, something that looked like a spiral made of intertwining human figures. "That wasn't there before," Mark said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "I studied this map for hours. That symbol, that whole section of water, none of it was there before." Behind us, the creature had stopped screaming, but I could still see it standing at the water's edge, watching our progress with Tom's stolen eyes, waiting. We paddled for hours through the increasingly strange waterway. The trees along the shores were no longer the familiar pines and birches of Minnesota wilderness. Instead, they were massive, twisted things with bark like scales and leaves that moved without wind. Some had faces embedded in their trunks, human faces with expressions of eternal anguish. The water itself grew thicker and darker as we progressed, until it resembled black tar more than any natural lake. Things surfaced occasionally near our canoes. Pale, reaching hands, faces that might once have been human, shapes that defied description. We stopped paddling and let the current carry us whenever possible, afraid that disturbing the water might attract more attention from whatever dwelt beneath. It was Jessica who first noticed we were being followed. "There's something behind us," she called out, pointing back toward the way we'd come. I turned to look and saw a dark shape moving through the water about 50 yards back. At first, I thought it might be a log or piece of debris, but it was moving against the current with obvious purpose. As it drew closer, I realized with growing horror that it was Tom, or rather, the thing that had been Tom. It was swimming, if you could call it that, with movements that were more serpentine than human, its distorted body undulating through the thick water with disturbing grace. "It's following us," Mark said, his voice tight with panic. "The thing that took Tom. It's following us." We redoubled our paddling efforts, but the creature was gaining ground. Worse, the channel ahead was narrowing and I could see what looked like a dead end approaching, a wall of twisted trees and thorny undergrowth that blocked any further progress. "There," Jessica pointed to what looked like a small opening in the vegetation. "We can beach the canoes and continue on foot." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was our only option. We drove our canoes hard onto the muddy shore and began pulling them up onto dry land. Behind us, the Tom thing was now close enough that I could see its face clearly, a horrible amalgamation of Tom's features and something else, something that had never been human. The opening in the undergrowth led to a narrow path that wound between the massive, twisted trees. We abandoned our canoes and ran, crashing through branches and thorns that seemed to reach out deliberately to snag our clothes and scratch our skin. The path led upward, climbing steadily away from the corrupted lake. Behind us, I could hear the creature crashing through the undergrowth in pursuit, its inhuman cries echoing through the twisted forest. After what felt like hours of running, we came to a clearing where the trees gave way to bare rock. In the center of the clearing stood a small log cabin, smoke rising from its chimney in a thin, welcoming stream. "Ezra's place," Mark gasped, bent over with exhaustion. "It has to be." We approached the cabin cautiously. After everything we'd experienced, even the promise of shelter seemed potentially dangerous. But as we got closer, I could see through the windows that the interior looked normal, rustic but comfortable, with handmade furniture and oil lamps providing warm, yellow light. Ezra appeared in the doorway before we could knock. He looked exactly as he had when we'd first met him, except for his eyes. They held a sadness and weariness that seemed to span centuries. "I wondered if you'd find your way here," he said quietly. "Come in, you're safe for now." The cabin's interior was larger than it appeared from outside, with additional rooms extending back into what should have been solid rock. Ezra gestured for us to sit by the fireplace, then poured steaming coffee from a pot that sat perpetually warming on the hearth. "Your friend," he said without preamble. "The quiet one with the camera. He's gone, isn't he?" Jessica started crying, the first tears any of us had shed since our ordeal began. Something took him. Something wearing his face came back, but it wasn't Tom anymore. Ezra nodded gravely. "The old hunger. It takes different forms, but it's always been here. Long before the first Europeans, long before the native tribes. This place, it's older than human memory, and it has its own needs." "What does it want?" Mark asked. "What it's always wanted. To expand, to grow, to add to its collection." Ezra's pale eyes fixed on each of us in turn. "Your friend was just the beginning. It would have taken all of you, given time, used your forms to lure others here, to feed the circle." "The mushroom ring," I said, understanding flooding through me. "One of many gateways, points where the boundary grows thin and other things can slip through. Your friend made the mistake of standing in the center. That's all it takes, an invitation, however unintentional." Outside the cabin, something howled in the distance. The sound was answered by others, creating a chorus of inhuman voices that seemed to surround us. "They know you're here," Ezra said calmly, "but they can't enter this place, not without an invitation." "How do we get out?" Jessica asked through her tears. "How do we get home?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of isolation and hard-won knowledge. "There is a way, but it requires sacrifice. One of you must remain." The silence that greeted this pronouncement was absolute, except for the crackling of the fire and the distant howling outside. "What do you mean?" Mark asked finally. "The balance must be maintained. 3 came into the circle uninvited. 1 was taken. For the other 2 to leave, 1 must stay willingly. That's how the old agreements work." "Agreements with what?" I demanded. "With the things that were here first, the things that sleep beneath the mushroom rings and walk between the twisted trees. They're not evil, exactly. They're just different. They operate by rules that predate human civilization." Jessica looked up, her face streaked with tears but set with determination. "I'll stay." "No," Mark said immediately. "Absolutely not. There has to be another way." "Is there?" Jessica looked at Ezra, who shook his head slowly. "The old compacts are binding. 1 must remain, or none may leave." I found myself speaking before I'd consciously made the decision. "I'll do it." "Sarah, no." Mark grabbed my hand. "We'll find another way. We'll all get out together." But even as he spoke, I could see in his eyes that he knew there was no other way. Outside, the howling had grown closer and more insistent. Whatever was out there was growing impatient. "Why you?" Jessica asked quietly. I thought about Tom, about how the thing wearing his face had said, "the woman first," when it thought we couldn't hear. I thought about Ezra's sad, ancient eyes and his talk of old agreements and necessary sacrifices. "Because it was always going to be me," I said. "From the moment we found that mushroom circle, maybe even from the moment we decided to come here." Ezra nodded slowly. "Some people are more sensitive to these places, more likely to be chosen. You felt it from the beginning, didn't you? The wrongness?" I had. From the moment we'd arrived, I'd sensed that something was off about this place. My dreams, my fears, my instinctive distrust of Ezra. It had all been preparation for this moment. "What happens to me if I stay?" I asked. "You become a guardian, a keeper of the boundaries, like me." Ezra's smile was infinitely sad. "It's not unpleasant, lonely sometimes, but you'll have purpose, and you'll ensure that others like your friends can find their way home safely." The howling outside reached a crescendo, then suddenly stopped. In the abrupt silence, I could hear something large moving around the cabin, testing the walls and windows. "You have to choose now," Ezra said. "Dawn is coming, and with it, your last chance to leave." Mark and Jessica both protested, but I'd already made my decision. Maybe I'd made it the moment we'd met Ezra, or when I'd first heard those whispers in the forest. Maybe it had been made for me long before I was born. "Take care of each other," I told them, then turned to Ezra. "What do I need to do?" The ritual was surprisingly simple. Ezra led me outside while Mark and Jessica watched from the cabin windows, their faces pressed against the glass like children watching a parade. The twisted trees formed a natural amphitheater around the clearing, and I could sense unseen presences gathered in their shadows. "Place your hand on the ground," Ezra instructed. "Speak your name and your acceptance of the compact." I knelt and pressed my palm against the bare earth. It was warm despite the cool morning air, and I could feel something vast and patient stirring beneath the surface. "My name is Sarah Rodriguez," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I accept the compact. I choose to remain." The ground beneath my hand pulsed once like a giant heartbeat. Then the warmth spread up my arm and through my entire body, bringing with it a strange sense of peace. For the first time since we'd arrived in this place, I felt truly calm. When I looked up, Ezra was smiling, not his previous sharp-toothed grin, but something genuine and relieved. "Welcome, sister," he said. "You won't be alone." Mark and Jessica were given 1 hour to say goodbye. We cried together, made promises we all knew couldn't be kept, and tried to pretend this wasn't really happening. But when the sun crested the horizon, painting the clearing in shades of gold and amber, it was time. I watched them disappear down the path that would lead them back to normal lakes and familiar forests. Ezra assured me they would find their way out safely. The compact guaranteed it, but I knew I would never see them again. That was 6 months ago. Since then, I've learned the true nature of this place and my role as its guardian. The forest is vast and full of wonders that would drive most people mad, but I've found a strange contentment in my new existence. I help lost travelers find their way home, maintain the boundaries between worlds, and keep the old hungers satisfied with minimal sacrifice. Sometimes, late at night, I dream of my old life in Minneapolis, of coffee shops and traffic jams and the simple pleasure of calling a friend on the phone. But those dreams feel like memories of someone else's life now, faded and distant as childhood. The thing that wore Tom's face still roams the deeper parts of the forest. I've seen it occasionally, always at a distance, always watching. But it no longer hunts humans with the same desperate hunger. Our compact has sated its needs, at least temporarily. Ezra has been teaching me the old ways, the knowledge necessary to maintain the balance. He's been here much longer than the 15 years he originally claimed, more like 50, he admitted once the compact was sealed. The forest changes those who serve it, slowing aging and extending life far beyond normal human limits. I can already feel the changes beginning in myself. 3 weeks ago, another group of campers found their way to the Mushroom Ring, young college students just like we had been. I was able to guide them away before they made Tom's mistake of standing in the center. They left convinced they'd simply gotten lost and found their way again through luck. They'll never know how close they came to joining the collection of faces that walk between the twisted trees. This is my life now, and while it's not the life I planned, it has its own strange purpose. I protect the boundary between worlds, ensuring that the old hungers remain contained while helping lost souls find their way back to the light. But I write this account as a warning. If you ever find yourself camping in the deep wilderness and things begin to feel wrong, if your electronics fail, if your maps don't match the landscape, if you encounter helpful strangers who cast no shadows, trust your instincts. Leave immediately. Don't investigate the strange mushroom circles or listen to whispers in the dark. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Some prices, once paid, can never be refunded. And some guardians, once chosen, can never go home. The forest is patient. It has all the time in the world. But for those who venture too deep into its domain, time becomes something altogether different, endless and circular, like the rings of fungi that mark the places where our world touches something far older and infinitely more hungry. Mark and Jessica made it home safely. I know this because the compact ensures it, and because sometimes, on quiet nights when the boundary grows thin, I can feel their distant presence in the world beyond the trees. They're living their lives, probably telling people about their friend Sarah who died in a tragic camping accident. Her body never recovered from the deep wilderness. In a way, they're not wrong. The Sarah Rodriguez who drove north with them that autumn weekend did die in these woods. What remains is something new, something changed by old agreements and necessary sacrifices. I am the guardian now, keeper of the boundaries, protector of both worlds. And when the next group of lost travelers finds their way to the Mushroom Rings, I'll be waiting to guide them safely home. It's a lonely existence, but it has its own rewards. Every life I save justifies the choice I made that dawn morning 6 months ago. The forest whispers my name sometimes, in voices that sound like wind through ancient pines. But I no longer fear its call. I am part of it now, and it is part of me. The compact binds us together in ways that transcend human understanding. This is my story, my warning, and my testament. Heed it well, and stay away from the deep places where the maps don't match the land and helpful strangers offer aid with too sharp smiles. The wilderness has its own rules, its own hungers, and its own way of claiming what it needs. Those who venture too far from the marked trails may find that the path home leads not to familiar territory, but to choices no one should ever have to make. Remember Tom, who stepped into a fairy ring and never came back the same. Remember the thing that wore his face and spoke with his stolen voice. Remember that some boundaries exist for good reason, and crossing them carries a price that echoes through generations. The forest is waiting. It's always waiting. And it has nothing but time. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness near Ely, Minnesota, during what was supposed to be a healing retreat with my 2 closest friends from college. The idea had been Emma's. After my messy divorce from Marcus, after finding him in our bed with his secretary like some cliché from a bad movie, she'd insisted I needed to reconnect with nature and find myself again. Julie had agreed, citing some article about forest bathing and mental health she'd read in her wellness magazine. I'd reluctantly agreed, mostly because the alternative was spending another weekend crying into a bottle of cheap wine while scrolling through Marcus's Instagram posts with his new girlfriend. We'd driven up from Minneapolis in Emma's Honda Pilot, loaded with enough camping gear to survive a month in the wilderness, though we'd only planned for 5 days. The October air had that crisp bite that made your lungs ache in a good way, and the maples were exploding in reds and golds that looked almost artificial against the steel-gray sky. Emma Chen had been my roommate sophomore year, a geology major with an infectious laugh and an unhealthy obsession with true crime podcasts. She was the practical one, the one who remembered to pack the water purification tablets and extra batteries. At 30, she'd never been married, claiming she was too picky, but I suspected she just hadn't found anyone who could match her intensity. Julie Thompson was our wild card. A kindergarten teacher with sleeve tattoos and a motorcycle license. She approached life like it was one big adventure waiting to happen. She'd been the one to suggest we go deeper into the wilderness, away from the established campsites. "Let's really disappear," she'd said, eyes gleaming with that familiar mischief that had gotten us into trouble more times than I could count. The first sign something was wrong should have been the map. We'd been hiking for 3 hours along what the ranger had marked as the Kekakabik Trail, following a route that would take us to a secluded lake Emma had found online. The photos had shown crystal-clear water surrounded by towering pines, the kind of place that looked like a postcard. But when we stopped to check our progress, the trail markers didn't match what was on our topographic map. "Are we supposed to be heading northwest?" Julie asked, squinting at her GPS device. The screen flickered, showing our location as a fuzzy approximation rather than the precise dot it had been displaying all morning. Emma frowned, studying the worn paper map with the kind of intensity she usually reserved for rock formations. According to this, we should have hit the lake turnoff about a mile back, but I don't remember seeing any side trails. I felt the first flutter of unease in my stomach, but I pushed it down. We were experienced hikers. We'd done sections of the Superior Hiking Trail together, had camped in the Adirondacks. This was just a minor navigation issue. "Maybe the map's outdated," I suggested, shouldering my pack. "Trails change, trees fall, rangers reroute paths all the time." Julie's GPS beeped, then went completely dark. She pressed the power button repeatedly, but the screen remained blank. "Shit, I charged this thing last night." "Mine's working fine," Emma said, pulling out her phone. Except it wasn't. The screen showed no signal, not unusual in the deep woods, but the battery indicator was flashing red despite being fully charged that morning. That should have been our cue to turn back. Should have been the moment we laughed it off and decided to stick to the main trails, maybe find one of those established campsites with the fire rings and picnic tables. Instead, Julie grinned and spread her arms wide. "See? The universe is telling us to really disconnect. No GPS, no phones, just us and the wilderness." She looked genuinely excited about the prospect, and her enthusiasm was contagious. We pressed on. The forest grew denser as we hiked, the canopy so thick that it felt like early evening despite being only 2 in the afternoon. The pine needles beneath our feet muffled our footsteps, creating an eerie silence broken only by the occasional crack of a branch or the distant call of a loon. The air smelled of earth and decay, that rich smell of things decomposing, returning to the soil. It was Emma who noticed the trees first. "Do these pines look wrong to you?" she asked, stopping beside a massive white pine that had to be at least 200 years old. Its trunk was scarred with deep gouges, too regular to be from lightning or storm damage. They spiraled around the bark in sets of 3, like claw marks from something impossibly large. Julie ran her fingers along the grooves, her expression puzzled. "Maybe bears, though I've never seen marks like these." "Bears don't climb this high," Emma murmured, pointing to similar marks 20 feet up the trunk. "And they don't leave patterns." I studied the scarring more closely and felt my skin crawl. The marks were too deep, too deliberate. They looked almost carved, like some kind of territorial marking or a warning. "Let's keep moving," I said, suddenly eager to put distance between us and whatever had made those marks. "We'll lose the light if we don't find a campsite soon." We found the lake just as the sun was beginning to set, and for a moment, all my anxiety melted away. It was perfect, maybe too perfect. The water was mirror still, reflecting the darkening sky so perfectly it was hard to tell where the lake ended and the heavens began. A small clearing on the eastern shore provided just enough flat ground for our tents, with a natural fire ring formed by glacial stones. "This is incredible," Julie breathed, dropping her pack and walking to the water's edge. "It's like we're the first people to ever see this place." Emma was setting up her tent with military precision, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. She kept glancing at the tree line, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. "How is this place not on any maps?" she asked quietly as I helped her stake down the rainfly. "A lake this size, this accessible. Someone should have cataloged it." "Maybe it's seasonal," I suggested, though even as I said it, I knew it didn't make sense. The lake was clearly permanent, carved deep into the bedrock by some ancient glacier. Or maybe we're just further off the trail than we thought. But as I set up my own tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The sensation crawled between my shoulder blades like cold fingers, making me constantly turn to scan the tree line. The forest was too quiet. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals, no buzz of insects. Just silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. We got our fire started just as full darkness fell, and the normalcy of the routine, gathering kindling, arranging logs, the familiar ritual of coaxing flame from tinder, helped settle my nerves. Julie produced a bottle of bourbon from her pack, and we passed it around as we cooked our dinner of freeze-dried pasta and reconstituted vegetables. "To Sarah's new beginning," Emma toasted, raising the bottle. "To freedom from cheating bastards and the courage to start over. To friendship," Julie added, "and to getting completely, utterly lost together." I managed to smile and took a swig of the bourbon, feeling the burn slide down my throat. "To whatever the hell we've gotten ourselves into." We laughed, and for a moment, it felt like old times. Like we were back in college, staying up too late and making bad decisions that would become good stories. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling up into the star-filled sky, and I started to relax. That's when we heard the first whistle. It came from across the lake, a long, low note that seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. Not quite human, but not entirely animal either. Julie sat up straighter, her head cocked to listen. "Loon," she suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. Emma shook her head. "Wrong pitch, wrong time of year. Loons don't typically call at night in October." The whistle came again, closer this time. Definitely closer. It had a quality that made my teeth ache, like fingernails on a chalkboard but pitched lower, more resonant. The fire seemed to dim as the sound echoed across the water, the flames flickering despite the still air. "Could be another camper," I said, though I didn't believe it. There was something wrong with that sound. Something that made the primitive part of my brain want to grab the nearest sharp object and find somewhere to hide. Julie stood up, peering into the darkness across the lake. "Hello," she called out. "Anyone there?" Her voice echoed off the water and died. Silence stretched for long minutes, broken only by the pop and hiss of our fire. Then, impossibly, her own voice called back. "Hello? Anyone there?" But it was wrong. The voice was Julie's, but the cadence was off, like someone doing a poor imitation. The inflection was different, older somehow, and it came from a different direction entirely, from behind us, in the forest. Julie spun around, her face pale in the firelight. "Very funny, guys. Which one of you—" "It wasn't us," Emma said quietly. She was gripping a piece of firewood like a club, her knuckles white. "We're both right here." The fire guttered suddenly, flames dying to barely glowing embers despite the pile of dry wood we'd fed it. The darkness pressed in around us, thick and suffocating. I fumbled for my flashlight, but when I clicked it on, the beam was weak and yellow, barely penetrating 3 feet into the black. "The fire," I said, my voice shaking. "Why won't it—" "Hello? Anyone there?" The voice came again, still Julie's but wrong. 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 It was moving, circling our campsite in the darkness beyond our dying fire. Julie grabbed a handful of dry pine needles and tossed them onto the embers. They should have flared up instantly, but instead they just smoldered, producing more smoke than flame. The acrid smell made my eyes water. "This isn't possible," Emma muttered, working frantically to rebuild the fire. "Pine needles are basically kindling. They should—" The laughter cut her off. It started as Julie's laugh, that infectious giggle that had gotten us through so many late-night study sessions and hungover mornings. But it stretched on too long, morphing into something else entirely, something that made my skin crawl and my heart hammer against my ribs. "We need to get to the tents," I whispered, grabbing my pack. "Whatever this is, we need to— Hello? Anyone there?" The voice was right behind us now, maybe 10 feet away in the darkness. But when I spun around with my flashlight, there was nothing, just trees and shadows and that oppressive silence. Emma had managed to coax a small flame back to life, and in its weak glow, I could see Julie's face. She was staring into the forest with an expression of absolute terror, her mouth slightly open, eyes wide and unblinking. "Julie!" I reached out to touch her shoulder, and she jerked away like I'd burned her. "Did you hear it?" she whispered. "Did you hear what it said after?" "After what?" Emma asked, adding more kindling to the struggling fire. "After it laughed." Julie's voice was barely audible. "It said my name. But not the way you say it. The way my grandmother used to say it. Before she died. Before she started forgetting who I was." The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. Our breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air, and the lake's surface started to steam like dry ice. The fire sputtered and died again despite Emma's efforts. "We're leaving," I said, starting to stuff my sleeping bag into its compression sack. "Right now. We'll hike out by flashlight if we have to." "In the dark?" Emma protested. "Sarah, we don't even know where we are. We could walk in circles for hours, or fall into a ravine, or we could stay here with whatever the hell is out there," I snapped, fear making me sharp. "I don't care if we have to walk all night. This place is wrong." Julie hadn't moved. She was still staring into the forest, and in the weak beam of my flashlight I could see tears streaming down her cheeks. "Julie, come on, help us pack." She didn't respond, didn't even blink. "Julie!" I grabbed her arm and shook her, hard. "We need to go." She turned to look at me, and for a second I didn't recognize her. Her pupils were dilated despite the light, and there was something cold and distant in her expression. Something calculating. "Why would we leave?" she asked, and her voice had that same wrong inflection as the echo we'd heard. "We just got here. We haven't even had time to explore." Emma grabbed my arm. "Sarah," she whispered urgently, "look at her eyes." I looked and my blood turned to ice water. Julie's eyes were black. Not just the pupils, the entire eye, from lid to lid, like pools of crude oil. And as I watched, horrified, she smiled. But it wasn't Julie's smile. It was too wide, showing too many teeth, stretching her mouth in ways that should have been anatomically impossible. "Run!" Emma breathed. We ran. I grabbed my pack and Emma grabbed hers, and we crashed through the underbrush like startled deer, our flashlight beams bouncing wildly as we stumbled over roots and ducked under low branches. Behind us, that horrible not Julie laughter echoed through the forest, following us, herding us deeper into the darkness. My lungs burned and my legs shook, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The laughter was always just behind us, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, but never quite gone. And worse than the laughter were the moments of silence, when I couldn't tell if we'd lost it or if it was simply watching us from the shadows. We ran until we couldn't run anymore, finally collapsing behind a massive fallen log that provided some cover. I pressed my back against the rough bark and tried to control my breathing, listening for any sound of pursuit. Emma huddled beside me, her face ghostly pale in the moonlight filtering through the canopy. "What happened to her?" I whispered when I could finally speak. "What the hell happened to Julie?" Emma shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I don't know. I don't know what any of this is. This doesn't happen. People don't just change like that." But they did, apparently. Because Julie, or the thing wearing Julie's face, was out there somewhere in the darkness, and we were lost in a forest that didn't exist on any map, with no way to call for help and nowhere to run. I checked my phone again, hoping against hope for even a single bar of signal. Nothing. The screen flickered and went dark, despite showing half a charge moments before. Emma's phone was completely dead, the screen cracked in a spiderweb pattern that definitely hadn't been there earlier. "The voices," Emma said suddenly. The echo of her voice. It knew exactly how she sounded. How is that possible? I didn't have an answer. Couldn't have an answer, because answering would mean accepting that something impossible was happening. Something beyond rational explanation. We heard it then, drifting through the trees. Julie's voice, but wrong, singing a song I remembered from childhood. "Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies." But the melody was off-key, discordant, and there were too many voices singing along. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, all slightly out of sync, creating a horrible chorus that seemed to come from every direction at once. "Ashes, ashes, we all fall down." The singing stopped abruptly, replaced by that oppressive silence. Then, much closer than it should have been possible, Julie's voice called out, "Sarah? Emma? Where did you go? I'm sorry I scared you. Come back to the fire. We need to talk." It sounded so normal, so much like the real Julie that for a moment I almost believed it. Almost stood up and called back. But then I remembered those black, empty eyes, and I pressed myself harder against the log. "I know you're out there," the voice continued, and now it was moving again, circling our position. "I can smell your fear. It's intoxicating." That wasn't a word Julie would ever use. She was direct, practical, not given to dramatic vocabulary. Whatever was wearing her face was slipping, revealing something else underneath. "Sarah, I know about Marcus," the voice said, and my blood froze. "I know what he did to you. How he made you feel worthless, unwanted. How you used to cry yourself to sleep wondering what was wrong with you." I hadn't told them about that. Hadn't told anyone about the nights I'd spent staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction with my ex-husband, wondering if I'd driven him away somehow. That was private pain, locked away where no one could use it against me. "Emma, sweet Emma," the voice continued, moving closer. "Still waiting for the perfect man, aren't you? Still telling yourself you're too good for anyone, when really you're just terrified of being hurt. Terrified of ending up like your mother, bitter and alone." Emma made a choking sound beside me. I knew about her mother. The woman had gone through 3 marriages and spent most of Emma's childhood taking her anger out on anyone within reach. But Emma had never talked about it openly, never acknowledged how it had shaped her fear of commitment. How could it know these things? How could it know our deepest, most private fears? Come out," the voice sang, reverting to that childlike melody. "I have so much more to tell you, so many secrets to share." I closed my eyes and tried to think. We couldn't stay hidden forever, and we couldn't outrun it. Whatever it was seemed to know these woods better than we did. Our only chance was to get back to the trail, back to civilization, back to a world where impossible things didn't happen. But which way was the trail? In our panicked flight, we'd lost all sense of direction. The canopy was too thick to see the stars clearly, and our compass, if it even worked anymore, was back at the campsite with everything else we'd abandoned. "I know you're listening," the voice said, and it was directly in front of our hiding spot now. "I can hear your heartbeats. Thump, 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 like frightened rabbits." A shadow fell across us, too tall and angular to be human. I held my breath and prayed to every deity I could remember, begging them to make it move on, to let us stay hidden just a little longer. The shadow shifted, and I heard the soft whisper of feet moving through dry leaves. It was leaving, searching elsewhere. I counted to 60, then to 100, before daring to breathe normally again. "We have to move," I whispered to Emma, "while it's distracted." She nodded, wiping tears from her cheeks. We gathered our scattered gear as quietly as possible and started moving deeper into the forest, away from the voice that wore our friend's face. The next few hours blurred together into a nightmare of stumbling through underbrush, jumping at every sound, and trying to navigate by the weak beam of our dying flashlights. We found what looked like an old deer trail and followed it, hoping it would lead to water, or at least somewhere we could get our bearings. Instead, it led us back to the lake. I knew it was the same lake because our abandoned campsite was still there. 3 tents arranged in a neat triangle, the cold remains of our fire, Julie's pack sitting exactly where she'd left it. But something was wrong with the scene. It took me a moment to realize what it was. There were no footprints. The soft earth around our camp should have been churned up from our panicked flight, but it was smooth and undisturbed. Even our tent stakes were driven into the ground with military precision, as if we'd never left. "This isn't possible," Emma whispered, echoing my thoughts. "We've been gone for hours. We ran through here like frightened rabbits," I finished, remembering the thing's words. Julie's pack was unzipped, its contents spilled across the ground in neat arrangements. Her clothes were folded, her toiletries lined up by size, her sleeping bag spread out as if she'd been preparing for bed. But in the center of the arrangement, written in what looked like charcoal from our dead fire, was a message. "Welcome home." "We need to get our stuff and leave," I said, though my voice shook. "Our supplies, the map, the—" "Sarah." Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "Look at the tents." I looked, and my heart nearly stopped. Our tents were glowing, not with artificial light but with a soft, phosphorescent glow that seemed to come from the fabric itself. And through the translucent walls, I could see shadows moving inside. 3 shadows, human-shaped, going through the motions of preparing for sleep. One of the shadows waved at us. I grabbed Emma's arm and pulled her back into the tree line. "We're not going back there. Whatever's in those tents, it's not us." "Then what are we supposed to do?" Emma asked, her voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. "We can't survive out here without our gear. No food, no shelter, no way to purify water." She was right, and we both knew it. October nights in northern Minnesota could drop below freezing, and we were both already shivering in our light hiking clothes. Without our sleeping bags and camping gear, we might not survive until morning. But the alternative, approaching those glowing tents and whatever was inside them, seemed even more dangerous. "There has to be another way," I said, though I didn't believe it. "Another campground, a ranger station, something." "In the middle of the Boundary Waters?" "Sarah, the nearest road is probably 20 miles away, and that's if we could find it. Which we can't, because we don't even know where we are." A sound drifted across the water. Soft singing, barely audible. It was Julie's voice again, but this time it sounded genuinely sad, lonely. She was singing "Amazing Grace," the hymn her grandmother had hummed while braiding Julie's hair on summer visits. The memory hit me like a physical blow, because Julie had shared that story with us just last week, over drinks after my divorce was finalized. "She's trying to lure us back," Emma said, but her voice lacked conviction. "It's not really her." But what if it was? What if something had happened to Julie at the campsite, some kind of medical event or psychological break, and we'd abandoned her when she needed us most? What if those black eyes had been a trick of the firelight, a product of our own fear and exhaustion? The singing stopped, and Julie's voice called across the water, clear and heartbreakingly familiar. "I'm sorry I scared you. Please come back. I don't want to be alone." Emma started to stand, and I pulled her back down. "No, whatever that is, it's not Julie." "How can you be sure?" Emma asked, tears streaming down her face. "What if we're wrong? What if she's hurt and we just left her?" I didn't have an answer for that because part of me was wondering the same thing. The rational part of my mind insisted that people didn't just develop black eyes and impossible smiles, that echoes didn't repeat conversations, that tents didn't glow with their own light. But I'd seen all of those things, experienced them with my own senses. Either I was having a complete psychological breakdown, or something impossible was happening in these woods. "Please," Julie's voice called again, and now she was crying. I could hear the sobs echoing across the water, could picture her sitting alone by our cold fire pit, wondering why her best friends had abandoned her. "I'm so scared. There's something wrong with this place. Something in the woods. I need you." Emma broke free from my grip and stood up. "I can't listen to this anymore. If there's even a chance it's really her—" "Emma, don't." But she was already walking toward the lake, her footsteps loud in the silence. I followed, cursing under my breath, knowing I couldn't let her go alone but terrified of what we might find. As we got closer to the campsite, the details became clearer and more wrong. Our tents were definitely glowing, pulsing gently like giant fireflies. The shadows inside had stopped moving and were now perfectly still, as if listening for our approach. And Julie was sitting by the fire pit exactly as I'd imagined, her back to us, shoulders shaking with sobs. She looked normal, human, exactly like the friend we'd hiked in with. Her blonde hair caught the moonlight, and she was wearing the same red fleece jacket she'd worn all day. "Julie," Emma called softly. "Are you okay?" Julie's sobbing stopped instantly. She didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge us in any way. She just sat there, perfectly still, like a statue. "Julie," Emma called again, taking another step forward. Slowly, impossibly, Julie's head began to turn. It rotated too far, well past the natural range of human motion, until she was looking at us over her shoulder with her head nearly upside down. Her face was Julie's face, but wrong. Features slightly out of proportion, smile too wide, eyes still that horrible black. "You came back," she said, and her voice came from everywhere at once, from her mouth, from the trees, from the water itself. I was getting lonely. Emma screamed and stumbled backward, but it was too late. The thing wearing Julie's face stood up in one fluid motion, no longer bound by human anatomy. Its limbs stretched and elongated, fingers extending into claws, neck stretching like rubber. It was still recognizably Julie, but distorted, corrupted, like a funhouse mirror reflection. "Don't run," it said in that horrible multi-layered voice. "We have so much to talk about, so many games to play." We ran anyway. This time, we didn't stop until we physically couldn't take another step. We were deeper in the forest than ever, surrounded by trees so old and massive they blocked out most of the sky. The air was thick with the smell of decay and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded me of overripe fruit. Emma collapsed against a moss-covered boulder, gasping for breath. "What is it?" she wheezed. "What does it want?" "I don't know," I admitted, though part of me was beginning to suspect, the way it knew our fears, our secrets, the way it had taken Julie's form so perfectly, the way it seemed to feed on our terror. "We have to assume Julie's dead," I said, the words tasting like poison. "Whatever that thing is, it's wearing her like a costume." Emma made a choking sound that might have been a sob or a laugh. "This isn't real. This can't be real. Things like this don't exist." But they did exist, apparently. In these woods, in this place that didn't appear on any map, impossible things were not only possible, but hunting us. I was starting to piece together a theory, though I hated every implication. The lake that shouldn't exist. The trails that led nowhere. The way our technology had failed the moment we'd entered this area. We weren't just lost. We were somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that operated by different rules. "We need to find running water," I said, remembering something from one of Emma's true crime podcasts. "Running water. Legends say some things can't cross it." "Legends?" Emma stared at me. "Sarah, we're talking about legends now. Do you have a better idea?" I snapped, because regular logic doesn't seem to be working here. She didn't have an answer for that. We set off again, moving carefully through the ancient forest, listening for the sound of flowing water. The trees here were different. Older, twisted into unnatural shapes, their bark scarred with the same spiral marks we'd seen earlier. Some of the scars looked fresh. We found the stream just as dawn was beginning to break through the canopy. It was narrow but fast-moving, maybe 3 feet across at its widest point. The water was crystal clear, so clear I could see every pebble on the bottom, every piece of driftwood caught against the banks. "Think it'll work?" Emma asked, eyeing the stream skeptically. "Only one way to find out." We crossed carefully, using fallen logs as bridges. The moment my feet touched the far bank, I felt something change. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on me all night lifted slightly, and for the first time in hours, I could take a full breath. "Better?" Emma asked, and I nodded. We followed the stream, hoping it would lead us out of the forest, back to civilization, back to a world where our best friend hadn't been replaced by something wearing her face. The water chattered over stones and around fallen branches, the most normal sound I'd heard since we'd made camp. It was mid-morning when we found the cabin. It sat in a small clearing beside the stream, a rustic log structure that looked like it had been there for decades. Smoke rose from the chimney, and I could see the warm glow of lamplight through the windows. It looked like salvation. "Should we?" Emma asked, and I could hear the hope in her voice. "Do we have a choice?" We approached carefully, but there were no signs of danger. A neat woodpile sat beside the porch, an old canoe was pulled up on the bank, and herb gardens lined the path to the front door. It looked like the kind of place you'd find in a nature magazine, the perfect wilderness retreat. I knocked on the door, and after a moment, it opened to reveal an elderly man with kind eyes and a salt and pepper beard. He looked exactly like what Central Casting would order for Wise Hermit. "Lost, are you?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight Scandinavian accent. Come in. You look like you've had a rough night." The cabin's interior was everything the outside had promised. Rough-hewn furniture, handmade quilts, the smell of wood smoke, and coffee. The man introduced himself as Eric Johansson, a retired park ranger who'd been living off-grid for the past 15 years. "Phone's been down for days," he apologized, ladling hot coffee into tin mugs. "Storm last week took out the line, but I've got a radio in the back room. We can call for help." Emma and I exchanged glances. We hadn't heard any storm, but then again, we'd only been in the woods for one night, hadn't we? "What day is it?" I asked, suddenly uncertain. Eric frowned. "Saturday, October 15th. Why?" We'd entered the woods on Thursday. We should have only been out there for one night, but it felt like days had passed. Time seemed fluid in this place, unreliable. "We lost a friend," Emma said quietly. "Something happened to her. Something... I don't even know how to explain it." Eric's expression grew serious. "These woods are old," he said finally. "Older than the maps, older than the treaties. The Ojibwe have stories about this place, warnings. They called it Wendigo territory." Wendigo. I'd heard the word before, in whispered stories around campfires. Something about cannibalistic spirits, hunger that could never be satisfied, creatures that wore human faces to lure their prey. "You think that's what we saw?" I asked. "I think these woods show us what we expect to see," Eric replied carefully. "What we fear to see. And sometimes, those things become real enough to be dangerous." He was being diplomatic, but I could see the knowledge in his eyes. He'd seen things too, experienced the wrongness that permeated this place. "The radio," Emma said urgently. "Can we call for help? Get search and rescue out here?" Eric nodded and led us to the back room, where an old ham radio sat on a cluttered desk. He turned it on and began trying to raise someone. anyone on the emergency frequencies. Static filled the room, punctuated by brief snatches of voices too distorted to understand. Then, clear as day, we heard Julie's voice coming through the speaker. "Sarah, Emma, are you there? I'm at the lake. I'm waiting for you. Please come back. I'm so sorry I scared you. It wasn't me. It was never me." Eric's face went pale. He turned off the radio immediately, but Julie's voice continued. "I know you can hear me. I know you're listening. Come back to the lake. We need to finish what we started." The voice was coming from the radio's speaker, even though the unit was clearly off. The display was dark, no power lights showing, but Julie's voice continued to pour out of it. "Eric knows," she said, and now the voice was different, older, hungrier. "Eric knows what lives in these woods. Don't you, old man? You've been feeding it for years. All those lost hikers, all those missing campers, you send them to the lake." "That's not true," Eric said, but his voice shook. "I've helped dozens of people get home safely." "Have you?" the voice asked, and now it was laughing. "Or have you been the shepherd, guiding the sheep to slaughter?" I looked around the cabin with new eyes, noticing details I'd missed before. The quilts were all different patterns, different levels of skill. The coffee mugs were mismatched, as if collected from many different sources. And on the mantelpiece, partially hidden behind a kerosene lamp, I saw something that made my blood freeze. A driver's license. Emma's driver's license. "Eric," I said slowly, backing toward the door, "how did you get Emma's license?" He followed my gaze and his face crumpled. "I can explain," he said, but his voice had changed. It was older now, tired. "You have to understand, I never wanted this, but it's been so hungry, and it's been so long since anyone came through these woods." Emma snatched her license from the mantel, her hands shaking. "How long have you had this? I haven't lost my license. It's right here in my—" She fumbled for her wallet, then went pale. "It's gone. When did it go missing?" "Time moves differently here," Eric said, sinking into a chair like an old man carrying the weight of decades. "You've been in these woods longer than you think. Much longer." "That's impossible," I said, but even as I spoke, I felt the truth of it settling into my bones. The exhaustion wasn't just from one night of terror. It was deeper, bone-deep fatigue that spoke of days or weeks of running, hiding, surviving. "The thing in the lake," Eric continued, staring into the fire. "It's old, older than the trees, older than the ice that carved these valleys. It feeds on fear, on despair, on the moment when hope finally dies. But it needs fresh meat too, fresh souls." "And you provide them," Emma said, her voice flat with accusation. "I tried to stop," Eric whispered. "God help me, I tried. But it has ways of making you comply. It shows you things. Your own death, the deaths of everyone you've ever loved. It makes you complicit until you can't tell the difference between saving yourself and damning others." The radio crackled to life again, Julie's voice pouring out with renewed malevolence. Poor Eric. Still trying to play the hero. "Tell them about the others, Eric. Tell them about the families who came through last month, the young couple on their honeymoon, the father and son on their first camping trip." "Stop," Eric begged, covering his ears. "Tell them how you watched from the trees while I wore their faces, while I learned their voices, while I fed on their terror and their flesh. Tell them how you helped dispose of what was left." I felt sick. The coffee I'd drunk burned in my stomach, and I realized with horror that I didn't know what else Eric might have fed us. What else we might have consumed in this place of lies and predation. "We have to go," I said, grabbing Emma's arm. "Right now." But when I turned toward the door, it was gone. The wall was solid logs, no opening, no way out. The windows had disappeared too, leaving us trapped in a room that was shrinking, the walls pressing inward with each passing second. "No," Eric said, standing up. But his voice was different now, younger, feminine. Julie's voice. "You can't leave yet. We haven't finished playing." Eric's face began to change, features shifting like melting wax. His beard dissolved, his hair lengthened and lightened. His body shrank and curved until Julie stood before us, perfect in every detail except for those horrible black eyes. "Did you really think the hermit was real?" she asked, laughing. "Did you think there was actually someone out here to save you? Oh, you poor, stupid little sheep." The cabin began to dissolve around us, walls becoming transparent, furniture fading like mist. We were back in the forest, standing in a circle of those twisted, scarred trees. The stream was gone. The clearing was gone. Everything had been an illusion, a trap baited with our own desperate hope. "How long?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How long have we really been here?" Julie, the thing wearing Julie's face, smiled that impossible smile. "Long enough for the search parties to give up. Long enough for your families to hold memorial services. Long enough for the world to forget you ever existed." I felt something break inside me then, some last vestige of hope or sanity. We were never getting out of these woods. We were going to die here, feeding this ancient hunger with our fear and our flesh. Everything we'd experienced, the cabin, Eric, even parts of our escape, had been orchestrated to maximize our terror, to season us like cattle before slaughter. But Emma wasn't broken yet. I saw something kindle in her eyes, a fierce determination that I recognized from our college days when she'd refused to let organic chemistry defeat her, when she'd spent sleepless nights in the lab until she'd mastered every reaction. "You made one mistake," she said to the Julie thing. "Oh? And what's that?" "You let us think we were running." Emma reached into her pack and pulled out something I hadn't seen her take from the camp, a small glass bottle filled with clear liquid. But geologists don't run from problems. We study them, we learn how they work, and then we break them. The Julie thing's smile faltered. "What is that?" "Hydrochloric acid," Emma said calmly, "for testing rock samples. I've been carrying it this whole time, wondering when I'd get the chance to use it." She uncapped the bottle and flung its contents at the creature. The acid hit its face and began to smoke, eating through whatever passed for its flesh. The thing that had been wearing Julie's form screamed, not with Julie's voice now, but with something inhuman, a sound like tearing metal and breaking glass. Its face began to melt, revealing something underneath that hurt to look at directly. Something with too many teeth and eyes like black holes and skin that moved independently of any underlying bone structure. "Run," Emma said quietly. "Run, and don't look back." We ran through the dissolving forest as reality reasserted itself around us. The twisted trees straightened, the oppressive darkness lifted, and suddenly I could see familiar landmarks. The real trail markers, the actual lake we'd been trying to reach. Behind us, the screaming continued, but it was getting fainter, more distant. Whatever Emma had done, it had bought us time. We stumbled out of the woods 3 hours later, emerging onto Highway 1 near Ely like refugees from a war zone. A park ranger found us there sitting by the roadside in shock and called for medical attention. They told us we'd been missing for 6 days. 6 days of searching, helicopters, dog teams, volunteers combing every inch of the Boundary Waters. They found our campsite eventually, but it was wrong. Our tents were shredded, our supplies scattered, clear signs of an animal attack. They found blood, but no bodies. They never found Julie. The official report blamed bears, though the ranger who'd found us kept asking questions about our story that didn't quite add up. How had we survived 6 days with no food or water? Why couldn't we remember most of what had happened? Where was our friend? Emma stuck to the story we'd agreed on during the ambulance ride. Julie had wandered off the first night. We'd gotten lost looking for her. We'd spent days wandering in circles before finding our way out. She never mentioned the creature, the impossible cabin, or what she'd done to save us. But sometimes, late at night, I catch her staring at nothing with that same fierce determination in her eyes. And sometimes I hear her whispering to herself, working through chemical formulas like prayers. We never went camping again. never even talked about those 6 days, as if speaking about them might somehow call that thing back into our lives. But I know Emma remembers. I know she sees it too sometimes, in reflections and shadows in the corner of her eye. Because it's not gone. Not really. Things like that don't die. They just wait. Somewhere in those woods that don't exist on any map, in that lake that shouldn't be there, it's waiting for the next group of friends to get lost. Waiting to learn their voices, their fears, their secrets. Waiting to play. The divorce papers came through 2 weeks after we got back. Marcus had the decency to seem concerned about my hiking accident, but I could see the relief in his eyes. Now he had a perfect excuse for why our marriage had failed. I'd obviously been unstable, prone to dangerous decisions, the kind of person who disappears into the wilderness and comes back changed. He wasn't wrong about the last part. I sleep with all the lights on now. I check every shadow, every reflection, every echo that might not be quite right, because I know what's out there in the dark places of the world, wearing familiar faces and speaking with beloved voices. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I hear Julie calling my name. The last entry in my journal from that trip, written in handwriting I don't remember forming, says simply, "We all fall down." I've burned that journal 3 times now. It keeps coming back. My name is Jennifer Williams and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, deep in Minnesota's Superior National Forest, where the ancient pines grow so thick they swallow sound itself. It was supposed to be our chance to reconnect. After 3 years of marriage and 2 miscarriages, David and I had grown distant, speaking in polite exchanges about grocery lists and utility bills. The wilderness retreat was my idea. 5 days in the Quetico Superior Wilderness, just us and the vast Canadian Shield country that stretched endlessly northward into Ontario. I'd read about a remote campsite near Knife Lake, accessible only by a grueling portage trail that most tourists avoided. "Are you sure about this, Jen?" David had asked, examining our rented canoe with the skepticism of a man more comfortable with conference rooms than campfires. "It's pretty isolated out there." David Chen, yes, I'd kept my maiden name, was a software architect who worked remotely from our Minneapolis apartment. At 32, he maintained the lean build of his college tennis days, though his hands had grown soft from years of keyboard work. He approached everything with methodical precision, from debugging code to packing our gear into neat, labeled stuff sacks. "That's the point," I'd replied, though now, paddling through the morning mist on Knife Lake, I wondered if isolation was what we really needed. The water stretched before us like black glass, reflecting the dense wall of jack pine and white spruce that rose from the rocky shoreline. Loons called in the distance, their haunting voices echoing off the granite cliffs. According to our map, the campsite sat on a small peninsula 2 miles north, marked only by a faded X on the weathered paper. "Water's getting rougher," David called from the stern, his paddle cutting efficiently through the choppy surface. Dark clouds gathered on the northern horizon, and the wind carried the metallic scent of approaching rain. We'd been paddling for 3 hours, and my shoulders burned with each stroke. The morning's optimism had faded with the sun, replaced by a growing unease I couldn't name. The shoreline looked identical, an endless parade of granite outcroppings and stunted pines. When I checked our GPS, the screen flickered with static before going black. "Battery died," I said, shaking the device. "That's impossible. I charged it last night." But it remained lifeless in my hands, its digital certainty replaced by the ancient uncertainty of unknown waters. We were navigating by compass now, following the shoreline north toward what our paper map promised was our destination. The campsite, when we finally found it, sat on a thumb of land jutting into the lake. A fire ring of blackened stones marked previous visitors, though the ashes looked old, mixed with pine needles and decomposing leaves. The tent sites were level, carpeted with soft duff, but something felt wrong about the place. Too quiet, maybe. Even the ever-present hum of insects seemed muted. "At least we beat the storm," David said, though his voice lacked conviction. The clouds now covered half the sky, and the wind had picked up, sending small whitecaps across the lake's surface. We worked in practiced silence, David stringing our tent between two sturdy pines while I organized our food and cooking gear. We'd done this dance dozens of times on weekend trips to state parks, but those had felt different, temporary inconveniences before returning to hot showers and soft beds. Here, surrounded by wilderness that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, our small dome tent seemed pathetically fragile. The first drops of rain began falling as David hammered in the final tent stake. Within minutes, the gentle patter became a steady drumming, then a full-scale downpour that sent us scrambling into our nylon shelter. We huddled inside, listening to the storm unleash itself on the forest around us. "Remember our first camping trip?" David asked, his voice barely audible above the rain. "Gooseberry Falls?" I nodded, though the memory felt distant, belonging to different people. That couple had laughed when their tent collapsed in a midnight thunderstorm, making love on soggy sleeping bags while rain drummed overhead. Now we lay carefully apart, separated by more than the space between our sleeping pads. The storm passed after an hour, leaving the forest dripping and fragrant with the scent of wet pine. We emerged to find our fire ring filled with water, the surrounding ground soggy with standing puddles. While David attempted to resurrect our campfire with damp wood, I walked the perimeter of our site, stretching legs cramped from our confined afternoon. The peninsula was smaller than it had appeared from the water, perhaps 50 yards at its widest point. Ancient pines dominated the landscape, their trunks easily 4 feet in diameter, probably survivors from before the logging boom of the 1800s. Between their massive bases, the forest floor lay thick with rust-colored needles that muffled every footstep. At the point's tip, I found something that made me stop. Carved into the bark of the largest pine, about head-high, were symbols I didn't recognize. Not initials or typical graffiti, but something older-looking, angular marks that seemed to form a pattern. The cuts were deep, scarred over with years of growth, but still clearly visible. "David," I called, "come look at this." He joined me, his hands still black with charcoal from coaxing our reluctant fire to life. "Probably just old surveyor marks," he said, though he studied the symbols with the same unease I felt. "Do they look like surveyor marks to you?" They didn't. The marks resembled pictographs, reminiscent of the Ojibwe petroglyphs we'd seen at other wilderness sites, but somehow different. Hungrier looking, if symbols could be said to hunger. "Let's head back," David said. "Fire's finally caught." Dinner was a quiet affair. Rehydrated pasta and lukewarm coffee heated over our stubborn camp stove. The fire provided more comfort than warmth, its flickering light pushing back the gathering darkness of the forest. We sat close together, not from affection but from the instinctive human need to maintain our small circle of light against the vast darkness beyond. "It's so quiet," I said eventually. "No birds, no insects. Even the loons stopped calling." David nodded, poking the fire with a stick. "Probably the storm. They'll be back tomorrow." But his words carried no conviction, and we both knew the silence was wrong. Even after storms, the Boundary Waters teemed with life, the splash of feeding fish, the rustle of small mammals in the underbrush, the subtle sounds of a living forest. Here, our whispered conversation seemed to echo in the unnatural stillness. As full darkness settled over the lake, our fire became the only light visible in any direction. No distant campfires dotted the shoreline. No hint of civilization's glow touched the horizon. We were truly alone in a way that modern humans rarely experience, surrounded by wilderness that had remained essentially unchanged for millennia. "I'm going to turn in," David said around 9 o'clock, though neither of us owned a watch that worked. Both had stopped sometime during the afternoon, their digital displays frozen at different times. "I'll bank the fire and join you in a minute." He kissed my forehead, a gesture that felt more habitual than affectionate, and disappeared into our tent. I sat alone by the dying flames, reluctant to extinguish our fragile barrier against the darkness. The night air carried strange scents, not just pine and lake water, but something underneath, something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. A branch snapped in the forest behind me. I turned, peering into the wall of black between the trees, but saw nothing, probably a falling limb, weakened by the storm. But as I sat listening, more sounds drifted from the darkness. Soft footsteps on wet pine needles, the quiet whisper of something moving through the underbrush. "David?" I whispered toward the tent. His only response was the deep, even breathing of exhausted sleep. I was alone with whatever moved in the forest around our camp. The footsteps circled us, staying just beyond the fire's dying light. Sometimes they paused, and I imagined unseen eyes watching from the darkness, studying our vulnerable camp. My rational mind insisted it was probably a curious bear or wandering deer, but my primitive brain screamed warnings that sent adrenaline flooding through my system. I fed more wood to the fire, grateful when the flames leaped higher, pushing back the encroaching darkness. The footsteps stopped, as if whatever stalked us had retreated from the renewed light, but I could still feel its presence, patient, hungry, waiting. I didn't remember falling asleep, but I woke to find our fire reduced to gray ash and the forest silent as a tomb. My watch, inexplicably, showed 3:17 a.m., though I could have sworn both timepieces had died the previous day. Beside me, David's sleeping bag lay empty, unzipped from the inside. "David!" I whispered, then louder. "David!" No response. I fumbled for my flashlight, clicking it on to reveal our small tent, empty, except for me. David's boots were gone, but his jacket hung on our gear line, despite the night's chill. I dressed quickly and emerged into the pre-dawn darkness. My flashlight beam swept across our campsite, revealing no sign of disturbance. The fire ring sat cold and dead. Our food hung safely in its bear-proof container, but David had vanished without a trace. "David!" I shouted, my voice echoing across the water before being swallowed by the surrounding forest. I followed our campsite's perimeter, calling his name and sweeping my flashlight across the tree line. At the peninsula's tip, near the carved pine, I found the first sign of him. Fresh boot prints in the soft earth, leading away from camp toward the narrow neck of land that connected us to the mainland. The trail was easy to follow at first. David's size 11 hiking boots left clear impressions in the damp soil, spaced with the regular gait of someone walking purposefully rather than fleeing in panic. But as the path entered the forest proper, the tracks became sporadic, visible only in occasional patches of bare earth between the thick carpet of pine needles. Deeper into the woods, following what might have been an old game trail, the prints changed. The stride lengthened, as if David had begun running. But running toward what? Or away from what? My flashlight beam danced ahead of me, illuminating twisted tree trunks and moss-covered boulders that seemed to shift and move in the wavering light. Every shadow might hide a crouched figure, every tree trunk might conceal watching eyes. The rational part of my mind insisted David had simply answered nature's call and gotten disoriented in the darkness, but the primal fear growing in my chest suggested something far worse. The trail ended at a small clearing perhaps half a mile from our camp. Here, the boot prints stopped entirely, as if David had simply vanished into thin air. I swept my flashlight across the open space, searching for any sign of passage, but found only undisturbed pine needles and the same unnatural silence that had plagued our campsite. "David, if you can hear me, please answer." My voice cracked with growing panic. "I'm scared." Something rustled in the trees at the clearing's far edge. I spun toward the sound, my flashlight beam catching a glimpse of movement, pale skin disappearing behind a massive pine trunk. "David, is that you?" I approached the tree cautiously, my heart hammering against my ribs. The bark bore fresh scratches, as if someone had clawed at it with their fingernails. Dark stains that might have been blood marked the deepest gouges. "David?" I whispered, circling the tree. He stood on the far side, his back to me, perfectly still in the gray pre-dawn light. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by concern. He wore only his underwear and hiking boots, his bare skin pale and goose-fleshed in the morning chill. "Honey, what are you doing out here? You're going to freeze." He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge my presence. I moved closer, reaching out to touch his shoulder, when something about his posture stopped me. He stood too still, like a mannequin positioned by an unseen hand. His arms hung loose at his sides, and his head tilted at an odd angle as if he were listening to something I couldn't hear. "David," I said more urgently, "you're scaring me." Slowly, he began to turn. The movement was mechanical, unnatural, like a figure on a music box winding down. When he finally faced me, I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam illuminating features I barely recognized. His eyes were the first thing I noticed. Completely black, not just the pupils but the entire visible surface, as if someone had filled them with ink. His skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality that revealed dark veins branching beneath the surface like the roots of some parasitic plant. But worst of all was his smile. Too wide, stretching his mouth into an expression of impossible happiness that never reached those terrible black eyes. "Hello, Jennifer," he said, his voice pitched slightly higher than normal, as if someone else were trying to imitate David's tone. "I've been waiting for you." Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I stood frozen, trapped by the impossibility of what I was seeing. This thing wore David's body, spoke with David's voice, but it wasn't David. Something else looked out through those obsidian eyes, something ancient and hungry that had been waiting in these woods long before we'd arrived. "Where is he?" I whispered. "Where's my husband?" The David thing's smile widened further, splitting at the corners where human mouths aren't meant to stretch. "He's right here, Jennifer. He's never been more present. Can't you see me standing right in front of you?" It took a step closer, and I noticed its gait was wrong. Too fluid, like it was floating just above the ground rather than walking. The morning air carried its scent now. That same organic wrongness I'd detected by our campfire, but concentrated and overwhelming. Rotting meat and wet earth and something else, something that made my stomach lurch with revulsion. "You're not David," I managed to say, backing away. "David would never. His eyes aren't what?" It cocked its head with bird-like curiosity. "Black? Dark? Like the spaces between the stars where the real hunger lives?" My flashlight flickered and dimmed, the beam growing weaker as if the thing's presence was somehow draining its power. In the failing light, I could see more details I wished I couldn't. The way its skin had begun splitting along stress lines, revealing something wet and writhing underneath. The fingernails that had grown into curved talons. The teeth that were now pointed and numerous, crowding its mouth like broken glass. "Run," it said conversationally. "That's what you want to do, isn't it? Run back to your little tent and pretend this is all a bad dream. Go ahead, Jennifer. I'll give you a head start." Instead, I did the only thing that made sense in a world gone mad. I turned and ran. Behind me, I heard laughter that started in David's familiar baritone but modulated into something inhuman, a sound like wind through hollow bones. My flashlight beam bounced wildly as I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and face. The game trail I'd followed seemed to have vanished, leaving me to navigate by instinct alone through the maze of ancient pines. Something pursued me through the darkness. Not footsteps. The sound was different, like something large slithering across the forest floor, accompanied by a wet, dragging noise that made my skin crawl. Whatever it was moved faster than any human could run, and it was gaining ground. I burst from the tree line onto our peninsula, our tent visible in the gray, pre-dawn light like a beacon of safety. But as I ran toward it, I saw that our campsite had changed. The tent sagged inward as if something had collapsed it from within. Our food containers lay scattered and torn open, their contents spilled across the ground and partially consumed by something with far too many teeth. The fire ring had been disturbed, the stones scattered and the ashes mixed with what looked like fragments of bone and flesh. And carved into the ground around our ruined camp, etched deep into the earth with inhuman precision, were symbols that matched those on the ancient pine, angular marks that hurt to look at directly, as if they violated some fundamental law of geometry. I grabbed our emergency satellite communicator from the tent's remains, praying it had survived whatever had destroyed our camp. The device powered on, its screen glowing reassuringly in the dim light, but when I tried to send a distress signal, the display showed only static. No satellites detected, no signal available. We were as isolated as if we'd been transported to another world entirely. The dragging sound grew closer, accompanied now by David's voice calling my name with artificial sweetness. "Jennifer, there's no need to be afraid. Come back and we can finish what we started. We can finally become close again, closer than any married couple has ever been." I looked across the dark water of Knife Lake, measuring the distance to the far shore. Perhaps half a mile, a difficult swim in warm weather, potentially fatal in the cold water of early morning. But staying meant facing whatever had taken David, and the growing certainty that death by hypothermia would be preferable to whatever that thing planned for me. I was stripping off my hiking boots when I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. David's voice, but coming from two different directions. The thing I'd encountered in the forest was approaching from the tree line, but another voice called from the water behind me. "Jen, thank God, there you are. I don't know what happened. I woke up in the woods with no memory of how I got there." I turned to see David wading out of the lake, water streaming from his clothes, his face creased with confusion and concern. He looked exactly as he had when we'd gone to sleep. No black eyes, no impossible smile, just my husband emerging from the water like some kind of miracle. "Stay away from me," I whispered, because nothing about this made sense. David couldn't swim well enough to cross half a mile of cold water, especially in his clothes. And if he'd somehow made it to shore and back, why would he have entered the water at all? "Jen, it's me," he said, continuing to wade closer. "I know this is confusing, but we need to get out of here. There's something wrong with this place. I found things in the woods. Remains. Old bones. This campsite isn't safe." From the forest behind me, the other David's voice grew closer. "Don't listen to it, Jennifer. That's not your husband. I'm your husband. Can't you see how wet it is? How wrong it looks?" I stood between them as they converged on our ruined campsite. Two identical versions of the man I'd married, each insisting the other was an imposter. The David from the water moved with familiar gestures, spoke with genuine concern in his voice. But the David from the forest had been the one I'd followed into the woods, the one whose boot prints I'd tracked. "Jennifer," said the wet David, now close enough that I could see water dripping from his hair. "Look at its eyes. Look at what it really is." "Look at its skin," countered the forest David. "See how pale it is? How cold? The lake is too far to swim. It's trying to trick you." They were both right. The wet David's skin had taken on a bluish pallor, and his movements seemed sluggish, as if the cold water had sapped his strength. But the forest, David's eyes reflected light strangely in the dim morning glow, and when he smiled, I caught glimpses of teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. "What year did we meet?" I asked suddenly. 2018, they said in unison. "Where?" "The coffee shop on University Avenue," they replied together. "You were reading The Handmaid's Tale, and I spilled my latte on your table trying to get your attention." My stomach dropped. They both knew details only David could know, responded with identical memories and mannerisms. Either both were imposters with impossible knowledge, or something far worse was happening. "The miscarriages," I whispered. "Tell me about the miscarriages." For the first time, their responses differed. The wet, David's face crumpled with familiar pain, the expression I'd seen too many times over the past 2 years. October 2022 and March 2023. We never picked names. You said it would be bad luck." His voice broke slightly on the last words, exactly as David's always did when we discussed our losses. "The forest?" David smiled instead, that same too-wide expression I'd seen in the clearing. "Such sadness, Jennifer. Such unnecessary sadness. I can give you children. I can give you so many children they'll overflow the forest. Would you like that? Would you like to be a mother to the hungry things that grow in the dark spaces between the trees?" The real horror wasn't that one of them was an imposter. It was that they both were. Something had taken David, learned everything about him, and created multiple versions of its understanding. The wet one had absorbed his memories and mannerisms but missed crucial emotional nuances. The forest one had focused on his appearance but couldn't mask the alien intelligence behind his eyes. My David was gone. Had been gone since I'd fallen asleep by the dying fire. Everything since then had been an elaborate game played by something that wanted to understand human attachment, human love, by wearing the face of the person I cared about most. "What do you want?" I asked, though I was no longer sure which version I was addressing. "To know," said the wet David. "To feed," said the forest David. "To become," they said together, and for a moment their voices harmonized in a way that made my teeth ache. The sun crested the eastern tree line as they closed in on me from both sides, its early light revealing details I'd missed in the darkness. The wet David's clothes weren't just soaked. They were torn and stained with algae, as if they'd been underwater for weeks rather than hours. The forest David's skin showed signs of accelerated decay around the edges, gray patches spreading outward from what looked like bite marks on his throat and wrists. They were both dead. Had been dead for hours. My husband's body was being worn like an ill-fitting costume by something that had never been human. I grabbed a burning brand from our scattered fire, one of the few pieces of wood that still held an ember, and swung it at the nearest figure. The wet David stumbled backward, hissing as the flame passed near his face, his features rippling like disturbed water. For a moment, I saw something else beneath the familiar surface, something with too many joints and angles that belonged to geometries that hurt to contemplate. The forest. David laughed and lunged forward, its movements suddenly predatory and inhuman. I spun and brought the burning wood across its reaching arms, and it shrieked, not with David's voice but with the sound of wind through a charnel house. Where the flame touched, its stolen skin peeled away like old paint, revealing writhing darkness underneath. Both creatures fell back, circling me like wolves, their David masks slipping to reveal glimpses of what lurked beneath. I kept the burning branch between us, grateful for the small protection it provided, but I could feel my temporary advantage slipping away as the wood consumed itself. "You can't fight us forever, Jennifer," said the wet thing that had been my husband. "We know you now. We know your thoughts, your fears, your desires. We know about the empty rooms in your house and the ache in your chest when you see other couples with their children. We can give you everything you've ever wanted." "We can give you David back," added the forest thing, "perfect and whole and loving. He'll never leave you again. He'll never disappoint you or forget your anniversary or work late when you need him. He'll be exactly what you want him to be." They were right about the children, about the empty rooms and the ache. They were right about David's flaws and my disappointments, but they were wrong about what I wanted. "I don't want a perfect David," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "I want my David, the one who burns toast and snores and leaves his socks on the bathroom floor, the one who held me while I cried after the second miscarriage even though he was crying too, the one who's brave enough to be imperfect." The burning brand was nearly consumed now, its flame guttering in the morning breeze. As the light dimmed, both creatures began to change, their stolen faces melting away to reveal the hungry darkness beneath. They were beautiful in their own terrible way, ancient beyond human comprehension, patient as the slow erosion of mountains, filled with appetites that predated language itself. But they weren't David. They never had been, never could be. As my makeshift torch died, I made my choice. The lake stretched behind me, its cold water offering the embrace of hypothermia over whatever these things intended. I turned and ran toward the shore, hearing them surge forward as my light failed. The water was shockingly cold, driving the breath from my lungs as I waded deeper. Behind me, the creatures had stopped at the water's edge, no longer wearing human faces. In the growing daylight, I could see them clearly for the first time. Things of shadow and hunger that had learned to wear human shapes but couldn't fully comprehend what it meant to be human. "You can't escape by drowning yourself, Jennifer," called the wet thing, though its voice now sounded like wind through empty caves. "We'll wait. We have all the time in the world. And when you crawl back to shore, blue-lipped and desperate, we'll be here with David's face and David's voice, ready to love you exactly as you deserve to be loved." The cold water reached my chest, then my neck. I had maybe 5 minutes before hypothermia set in, perhaps 10 before I lost consciousness entirely. Not much time to swim half a mile to the distant shore, but enough time to deny these creatures the satisfaction of whatever they had planned. I struck out toward the far shoreline with strong, desperate strokes, my body already numbing from the cold. Behind me, I could hear them calling with David's voice, promising warmth and safety and all the things I'd lost. But I kept swimming, focusing on the distant trees that marked the far shore and the slim possibility of survival that lay beyond. The cold sapped my strength faster than I'd expected. Halfway across the lake, my strokes became clumsy and uncoordinated. My legs felt like lead weights, dragging me down despite my desperate efforts to stay afloat. The distant shore seemed no closer than when I'd started, and I realized with growing certainty that I wasn't going to make it. As my vision began to blur and my movements became increasingly erratic, I heard the sound of an engine approaching from the south. A boat, an actual boat with actual people, was cutting across the lake toward me. I tried to wave and shout, but my arms barely responded and my voice emerged as little more than a whisper. The boat slowed as it approached, and I heard voices calling out in concern. Strong hands pulled me from the water, wrapping me in blankets as I shivered uncontrollably. Through chattering teeth, I tried to explain about David, about the creatures on the peninsula, but my rescuers, 2 park rangers on an early morning patrol, clearly thought I was suffering from hypothermia-induced delirium. "We'll get you to the hospital," said the older ranger, a weathered man with kind eyes. "Then we'll send a team back to look for your husband." They found David's body 3 days later, washed up on a rocky shore 10 miles north of our campsite. The official cause of death was drowning, though the coroner noted unusual damage to the corpse, bite marks from no animal she could identify, and strange symbols carved into his chest that matched no known cultural practices. The investigation concluded that he'd suffered some kind of psychotic break, attacked himself with a knife, and stumbled into the lake in his delirium. I never told them about the things I'd seen wearing his face. Who would believe such a story? Instead, I nodded along with their theories and answered their questions about David's mental health, his medication, his recent stress levels. I played the role of the grieving widow trying to make sense of her husband's inexplicable breakdown. But sometimes, late at night in our empty apartment, I catch myself looking toward the door and expecting to see David walk through it. Not my David, the other ones, the hungry things that learned to speak with his voice and smile with his face. They promised they would wait, and things that old understand patience in ways humans never could. I've started sleeping with the lights on, though I know it won't help if they decide to come for me. And I've been having dreams about the Boundary Waters, about dark water and ancient pines and symbols carved into living wood. In the dreams, David calls my name from just beyond the circle of firelight, promising that everything will be all right if I just step into the darkness where he's waiting. I know they're just dreams. But I also know that some hungers never die, and some promises echo across vast distances to find their intended targets. The creatures in the forest learned something about love during our brief encounter. Not what it truly means, but what it looks like from the outside. How it can be weaponized and perverted to serve their ancient needs. They're still out there, wearing faces stolen from other campers, other hikers, other couples who ventured too deep into places where civilization's light doesn't reach. And sometimes, when the apartment grows too quiet and the loneliness becomes unbearable, I find myself wondering what it would be like to go back to that peninsula on Knife Lake, to walk again among those towering pines where something waits with David's face and David's voice and David's promises of eternal togetherness. I won't go back. I can't. But on the darkest nights, when sleep refuses to come and the empty rooms echo with phantom footsteps, I understand why someone might make that choice. There are worse things than losing yourself to something ancient and hungry. Sometimes the worst thing is having to live with what you've lost, knowing that perfect imitations wait in the darkness, ready to love you exactly as much as you can bear. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Kabetogama Peninsula, deep in the Voyageurs National Park in northern Minnesota, where the ancient forests stretch endlessly toward the Canadian border and civilization feels like a distant memory. I should have known something was wrong when my compass started spinning wildly 3 miles into our hike, but I was too caught up in the excitement of finally taking this trip with my younger brother Jake and our childhood friend Tommy. We'd been planning this wilderness camping expedition for months. 5 days of complete isolation in one of Minnesota's most remote regions, accessible only by canoe and foot trails that hadn't seen maintenance in years. Jake, 28 and always the optimist, laughed when I showed him the compass. Technology, right? GPS will get us there. But when I pulled out my phone, the screen showed nothing but static where the map should be. Tommy, our group's self-appointed survival expert despite never having spent more than a weekend in the woods, shrugged it off. We've got paper maps. We're not tourists. The October air carried that sharp bite that warned of early winter, and the maples had already shed most of their leaves, creating a carpet that muffled our footsteps. The silence felt different here, not peaceful but expectant. Waiting, even the birds seemed to have abandoned this stretch of wilderness. We'd started at the Ash River Visitor Center at dawn, paddled across Kabetogama Lake in our rented canoe, and then began the hike inland toward what the old maps called Blind Ash Bay. The locals at the outfitter had been strange about our destination, exchanging glances when Tommy mentioned where we were headed. Haven't had anyone go out that way in, must be 2 seasons now, the grizzled man behind the counter had said, his weathered fingers drumming against the wood. Trails probably grown over. Might want to consider the established campsites instead. But Tommy had insisted. He'd found references to Blind Ash Bay in some obscure hiking forum, descriptions of pristine wilderness and fishing spots that hadn't been touched by commercial tourism. Places like this are disappearing, he'd argued. We need to see it while it's still wild. Now, 6 hours into our hike with daylight fading fast, I was beginning to understand the outfitter's reluctance. The trail had indeed grown over, forcing us to push through increasingly dense undergrowth. Branches caught at our packs, and more than once we'd had to backtrack when the path simply vanished into walls of thorny brush. The paper map, which had seemed so reliable that morning, no longer matched the terrain around us. We should make camp soon, I called ahead to Tommy, who was cutting through a particularly dense thicket with his camping hatchet. We've got maybe an hour of good light left. Just a bit further, Tommy called back, his voice strained with exertion. According to the map, there should be a clearing up ahead. Perfect campsite. Jake, bringing up the rear, caught up to me. Sweat beaded his forehead despite the cool air, and his usual grin had faded to a tight-lipped expression of concentration. "Mike," he said quietly, "does something feel off to you? About this place?" I'd been trying to ignore the same feeling, a crawling sensation between my shoulder blades like being watched by unseen eyes. The forest around us felt wrong, somehow. Too quiet, too dense. The trees seemed to lean inward, creating a canopy so thick that even in October, little light filtered through. "It's just unfamiliar territory," I said, trying to convince myself as much as Jake. "We're further from civilization than we've ever been." But even as I said it, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. The trees we were walking past, massive white pines and paper birches that should have taken decades to grow, had strange markings carved into their bark. Not initials or casual graffiti, but deep gouges that formed symbols I didn't recognize. Some of the carvings looked fresh, the exposed wood still weeping sap, while others were old enough that the bark had begun to grow back over them. "Tommy," I called, "wait up. Look at these trees." Tommy stopped his hacking and turned back, wiping sweat from his brow. When he saw what I was pointing at, his expression darkened. "Probably just old hunting marks," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Boundary markers or something?" Jake ran his finger along one of the deeper carvings, a twisted spiral that seemed to pull the eye inward. "This is fresh," he said. "Look, you can see where the bark's been peeled away recently." A sound echoed through the forest then, distant but unmistakable, a rhythmic thudding, like an axe biting into wood. We all froze, listening. The sound came again, measured and deliberate, from somewhere ahead of us on the trail. "Other campers," Tommy said, but he didn't sound convinced. According to the ranger at the visitor center, we should have been the only people in this section of the park. The permits for this area were limited, and ours were the only ones issued for this week. The chopping continued for several minutes, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "We should introduce ourselves," Jake suggested, though he made no move to continue forward. "Maybe they know the area better than we do." I was about to agree when a new sound drifted through the trees. A voice, singing or chanting in a language I didn't recognize. The melody was haunting, almost hypnotic, but there was something fundamentally wrong with it. The notes seemed to hang in the air too long, and the rhythm didn't quite match human speech patterns. Tommy had gone pale. "That's not English," he whispered. "Maybe French," I suggested weakly. "There are French-Canadian communities up near the border." But I knew it wasn't French, or any other language I'd ever heard. The sounds were too guttural, too hungry. They made my teeth ache and my skin crawl, as if my body was rejecting the very vibrations in the air. The chanting stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving us in that oppressive silence. We stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, waiting for some sign of normal human activity. When none came, Tommy shouldered his pack again. "We're losing light," he said. "We need to find that clearing and set up camp. Whatever that was, we'll deal with it in the morning." Reluctantly, Jake and I followed him deeper into the forest. The trail, such as it was, continued to deteriorate. Fallen logs blocked our path, forcing us to climb over or around them. The undergrowth grew thicker, grabbing at our clothes and gear. More than once, I felt thorns tear through my jacket, leaving shallow scratches on my arms. The carved symbols appeared more frequently now, marking trees on both sides of the path. Some were simple spirals or angular lines, but others were more complex. Intricate designs that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. I found myself avoiding eye contact with the carvings, focusing instead on placing one foot in front of the other. "There," Tommy called out suddenly. "I can see open sky ahead." He was right. Through the thinning trees, I could make out a patch of gray evening sky. We pushed through the last of the undergrowth and emerged into a circular clearing about 50 feet across. The space was unnaturally perfect. The grass was short and even, as if it had been recently mowed, and the tree line formed an almost perfect circle around the perimeter. In the center of the clearing stood a ring of stones, clearly arranged by human hands. Each stone was roughly the size of a person, standing upright like primitive monuments. Between the stones, the grass was blackened as if by repeated fires, and the air carried a faint smell of charcoal and something else, something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't identify. "This place gives me the creeps," Jake said, dropping his pack at the edge of the clearing. "Maybe we should push on, find somewhere else to camp." But Tommy was already examining the stone circle, his earlier enthusiasm returning. "This is incredible," he said. "It's like a primitive ceremonial site. Do you think it's Native American? Or maybe something left by early French explorers?" I wanted to agree with Jake, to pack up and keep moving. But darkness was falling fast, and we'd been hiking for hours through increasingly difficult terrain. The thought of trying to navigate the overgrown trail in the dark was more frightening than camping near the strange stone circle. "We'll stay here for the night," I decided. "But we camp at the edge of the clearing, not near those stones." We set up our tents in a triangle at the tree line, with our campfire pit positioned between them and the stone circle. As we worked, I noticed more unsettling details about our campsite. The trees surrounding the clearing all bore those same carved symbols, and many of them showed signs of damage, deep gouges in the bark, branches broken off at unnatural angles, and what looked like claw marks scoring the trunks. By the time we had our tents up and a fire started, full darkness had settled over the forest. The flames cast dancing shadows that made the stone circle look even more ominous, the upright rocks resembling hunched figures gathered around some dark ritual. We cooked a simple dinner of canned soup and instant coffee, but none of us had much appetite. The fire seemed to burn lower than it should, despite our efforts to feed it, and the light it cast felt inadequate against the pressing darkness of the forest. Beyond the small circle of firelight, the trees formed an impenetrable black wall. "Anyone else having trouble with their gear?" Jake asked, pulling items from his pack. "My sleeping bag is damp, and I swear it was dry when I packed it this morning." I checked my own equipment and found the same problem. My sleeping bag, spare clothes, and even my sealed food containers were all slightly damp, as if they'd been sitting in a humid basement for weeks rather than carried in a waterproof pack for a single day. "Condensation from the temperature change," Tommy suggested, but he sounded uncertain. His own gear showed the same mysterious dampness. As we sat around the struggling fire trying to dry our equipment, the forest around us came alive with sounds. Not the normal nighttime chorus of insects and small animals, but something else entirely. Footsteps circled our camp, slow, deliberate steps that crunched through the fallen leaves. Sometimes the steps seemed to come from just beyond the tree line, other times from much deeper in the forest, but they never stopped completely. "Animals," Tommy whispered, but his hand had moved to the camping hatchet at his belt. The footsteps were too measured, too purposeful to be animals. They maintained a steady rhythm, always just out of sight, as if whoever, or whatever, was making them wanted us to know they were there without revealing themselves. Around midnight, Jake dozed off in his camp chair, his chin dropping to his chest. Tommy and I continued to tend the fire, neither of us wanting to be the first to suggest we turn in for the night. The footsteps had stopped about an hour earlier, but the silence felt more threatening than the sounds had been. "Mike," Tommy said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Look at Jake." I turned to look at my brother and felt my blood freeze. Jake was still sitting in his chair, apparently asleep, but his eyes were open. Not just open, wide open, staring fixedly at something beyond the fire, and he was smiling. Not his usual warm grin, but something else entirely. A smile that was too wide, too still, and completely wrong on his familiar face. "Jake," I called softly. He didn't respond, didn't blink, just continued staring and smiling that terrible smile. "Jake," I said louder, reaching over to shake his shoulder. The moment my hand touched him, his head snapped toward me with unnatural speed. His smile widened impossibly, stretching his face into something that barely looked human. His eyes, still fixed and unblinking, reflected the firelight like an animal's. "I'm fine, Mike," he said, and his voice was perfectly normal, perfectly Jake. But that smile never wavered, and his eyes never blinked. Tommy had gone completely still beside me, his hand gripping the hatchet so tightly his knuckles were white. "Jake," he said carefully, "what are you looking at?" Jake's head turned toward Tommy with that same unnatural speed. "The trees," he said in his normal voice, that horrible smile still stretching his features. "They're so beautiful at night. Don't you think they're beautiful, Tommy?" I followed Jake's gaze toward the tree line and saw nothing but darkness. But as I stared, I began to make out shapes moving between the trunks. Tall, thin figures that swayed slightly as if blown by a wind I couldn't feel. The longer I looked, the more figures I could see, until it seemed like dozens of them stood just beyond the reach of our firelight. "We need to get out of here," I whispered to Tommy. But when I turned back to my brother, his chair was empty. Jake was gone. "Jake!" I shouted, jumping to my feet. "Jake, where are you?" Tommy was on his feet too, the hatchet in his hand, spinning in slow circles as he scanned the clearing. The fire had died down to barely glowing embers, despite the fact that we'd fed it fresh wood only minutes before. "He was right there," Tommy said, his voice tight with panic. "He was sitting right there, and I was looking right at him." We called Jake's name until our voices were hoarse, but the forest swallowed our shouts without even an echo. The strange figures I'd seen between the trees were gone now, leaving only impenetrable darkness. "His pack," I said, rushing to Jake's tent. "His stuff is still here. He wouldn't have gone anywhere without his gear." But when I unzipped Jake's tent, I found it empty except for his sleeping bag, unzipped from the inside, as if he'd climbed out of it and simply vanished. Tommy and I spent the rest of the night huddled by the dying fire, taking turns keeping watch. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every sound made us jump. The carved symbols on the surrounding trees seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, and I could swear I saw them shifting and changing when I wasn't looking directly at them. Dawn came gray and overcast, with a thick fog that made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Jake was still missing, and our shouts into the fog went unanswered. "We have to find him," I said, though the thought of venturing into the fog-shrouded forest terrified me. "He probably got disoriented in the dark," Tommy agreed, but he didn't sound convinced. "Wandered off and got lost. The fog will lift, and we'll spot him from the clearing." But the fog didn't lift. If anything, it grew thicker as the morning wore on, until we could barely see the stone circle in the center of the clearing. Our fire had gone completely cold despite our efforts to revive it, and when I tried to light a new one, the matches wouldn't strike. Even my supposedly wind-proof lighter produced nothing but cold sparks. "The wood's too damp," Tommy said, but we both knew that wasn't the real problem. Something was actively working against us, making our basic survival tools fail when we needed them most. Around noon, we heard footsteps approaching through the fog. Slow, measured steps that crunched through the fallen leaves with mechanical regularity. "Jake?" I called out hopefully. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, the only sound was our own ragged breathing. Then a voice answered from the fog. Jake's voice, but wrong somehow. Flatter. Emotionless. "I'm here, Mike." The voice came from the direction of the stone circle, though the fog was too thick for us to see anything. Tommy raised his hatchet, and I picked up a heavy branch from our pile of useless firewood. "Jake, come closer," I called. "We can barely see you." "I can see you perfectly," came the reply. Still Jake's voice, but with that same flat quality that made my skin crawl. "You both look scared." A shape began to emerge from the fog near the stone circle, tall and thin, moving with that same measured gait we'd heard circling our camp the night before. As it came closer, I could make out more details, and my stomach lurched with recognition and revulsion. It was Jake, or at least something wearing Jake's face and clothes. But everything about him was subtly wrong. He moved too stiffly, like a marionette controlled by an inexpert puppeteer. His skin had a grayish pallor, and his eyes reflected the dim light like polished glass. Most disturbing of all was his expression, that same too-wide smile from the night before, frozen on his face like a death mask. "You were worried about me," the thing that looked like Jake said, tilting its head at an unnatural angle. "That's very touching." "Jake, what happened to you?" I asked, though every instinct screamed at me to run. "I met the others," it replied, its smile somehow becoming even wider. "The ones who live in the trees. They've been waiting so long for visitors. They're hungry, Mike, so very hungry." Tommy stepped forward, raising the hatchet. "That's not Jake," he said grimly. "I don't know what it is, but it's not him." The thing wearing my brother's face turned its attention to Tommy, and when it spoke, its voice carried an undertone of something ancient and malevolent. Poor Tommy, always so paranoid, always so suspicious. But you're right, of course. Jake is gone. I'm just borrowing his shape for a while. As it spoke, its appearance began to shift and change. Jake's familiar features melted and reformed, becoming something gaunt and predatory. Its limbs elongated, its fingers stretching into claw-like appendages. Its smile revealed rows of yellowed teeth that belonged in no human mouth. "Run," I whispered to Tommy. We turned and fled toward the tree line, crashing through the undergrowth in blind panic. Behind us, the creature that had been wearing Jake's face let out a sound that was part laughter, part hunting cry. Other voices answered from the forest around us. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all taking up that same inhuman call. The fog seemed to follow us as we ran, making it impossible to see where we were going. Branches tore at our clothes and skin, and more than once I stumbled over hidden roots or fallen logs. Tommy stayed close beside me, the hatchet still clutched in his hand, but I could hear him gasping for breath. "The trail," he panted. "We need to find the trail back to the lake." But in the fog-shrouded forest, every direction looked the same. The carved symbols on the trees seemed to be our only landmarks, but they offered no guidance. If anything, they appeared to be leading us deeper into the wilderness, away from any hope of civilization. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, finally collapsing behind a massive fallen pine that offered some concealment. The hunting calls had faded, but I knew our pursuers were still out there, tracking us through the fog with senses far keener than our own. "What were those things?" Tommy whispered, his face pale with exhaustion and terror. I thought about the stories I'd heard growing up in Minnesota, old legends about creatures that lived in the deep woods, beings that could take on human form but were fundamentally inhuman. Wendigos, the Ojibwe called them. Ancient spirits of cannibalism and endless hunger. "I don't know," I lied, because knowing wouldn't help us survive, and survival was all that mattered now. We huddled behind the fallen tree for what felt like hours, listening for any sign of pursuit. The fog began to thin slightly, revealing glimpses of the forest around us. What I saw made my heart sink. We were in a part of the woods I didn't recognize, surrounded by trees bearing those same carved symbols. Worse, many of the symbols appeared to be fresh, as if they'd been carved recently, maybe even while we'd been running. Someone's been marking our path, I realized with growing horror, herding us. Tommy followed my gaze to the symbols and went even paler. "They're everywhere," he whispered, "on every tree." As we watched, new symbols began to appear on the bark nearest to us, not carved by any physical blade, but seeming to burn themselves into the wood with invisible fire. The smell of charred bark filled the air, and I could hear a faint sizzling sound as the marks took shape. We were being marked, claimed. "We have to keep moving," I said, though every muscle in my body screamed in protest. "Staying in one place makes us easy targets." We forced ourselves to stand and continue through the fog-shrouded forest. Without any clear landmarks, we simply headed in what we hoped was the direction of the lake, pushing through increasingly dense undergrowth. The symbols followed us, appearing on every tree we passed, fresh marks that seemed to burn with their own malevolent energy. After what felt like hours of stumbling through the wilderness, we heard the sound of running water somewhere ahead. Hope flared in my chest. If we could find a stream, we might be able to follow it back to the lake. But when we pushed through a final wall of brush, we didn't find a stream. Instead, we found ourselves back in the circular clearing with its ring of standing stones. Our abandoned campsite sat exactly as we'd left it, our tents still pitched at the tree line, our cold fire pit surrounded by our scattered gear. "That's impossible," Tommy said, staring at the familiar scene. "We ran for miles. We couldn't have circled back." But there was no denying what we saw. Even our footprints from the morning were still visible in the soft earth, leading from our tents to the edge of the clearing where we'd heard the thing pretending to be Jake. "The forest is playing with us," I said, the full horror of our situation finally sinking in. "It's not going to let us leave." As if in response to my words, figures began to emerge from the fog at the edges of the clearing. Tall, thin shapes that moved with that same unnatural gait we'd come to associate with the creatures hunting us. Some maintained a roughly human appearance, while others had let their disguises slip, revealing the gaunt, predatory forms beneath. And there, among them, was Jake, or the thing that had been wearing his face. It looked more like my brother now, as if it had been practicing, perfecting its imitation. "You came back," it said with Jake's voice, Jake's smile. "I knew you would. The forest always brings people back to where they belong." The creatures formed a circle around the clearing, blocking any escape. Up close, I could see that each of them bore some resemblance to a human, man, woman, child, but all wrong in subtle ways. Their proportions were off, their movements too fluid or too rigid, their smiles too wide and their eyes too bright. "Who are you?" I called out, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "We're the ones who stayed," the Jake thing replied. "The ones who came to the forest seeking something and found more than they bargained for. Hunters, hikers, campers, researchers, all drawn to this place by stories and legends and the promise of untouched wilderness." "And now you're trapped here," Tommy said, raising his hatchet defensively. The creature's smile widened impossibly. "Trapped? Oh no, Tommy. We chose to stay. The forest showed us what we really were underneath all that civilization, all that pretense. It showed us how good it feels to hunt, how sweet it is to feed." More figures emerged from the fog, dozens of them now, all bearing the twisted semblance of humanity. Some looked recently changed, their human features still mostly intact. Others had been in the forest longer, their forms more dramatically altered by whatever force controlled this place. "The hunger starts slowly," the Jake thing continued, beginning to walk toward us with measured steps. "Just a nagging emptiness that food can't fill. But it grows, Mike. It grows until it's all you can think about, until you realize that what you're hungry for isn't food at all." I understood then what had happened to all the missing hikers and campers over the years, the ones who'd ventured into the deep wilderness and simply vanished. They hadn't gotten lost or fallen victim to accidents. They'd found this place, or it had found them, and they'd been changed into something else. Something that wore human faces but harbored an inhuman hunger. The circle of creatures was tightening now, moving closer with each step. Their eyes all reflected the dim light filtering through the fog, giving them the appearance of a pack of wolves closing in on their prey. "You can fight it," the Jake thing said, now only a few yards away. "For a while, but eventually the hunger wins. It always wins, and then you'll understand why we stay, why we choose this." Tommy stepped forward, swinging the hatchet in a wide arc. The blade bit deep into the creature's shoulder, and black fluid spurted from the wound. But instead of falling or crying out in pain, it simply looked down at the injury with mild interest. "That tickles," it said in Jake's voice, then backhanded Tommy across the clearing. Tommy hit the ground hard and didn't get up. I could see him breathing, but he lay motionless, either unconscious or too injured to move. The creature turned its attention back to me, the wound already beginning to close. "You can't hurt us, Mike. We're not really alive anymore. Not in the way you understand it. We're something else now, something better." "What do you want?" I asked, backing toward the stone circle in the center of the clearing. "To share the gift," it replied, following my retreat with unhurried steps. "To help you become what you're meant to be. The forest has been patient, but its patience isn't infinite. It's time for you to choose." Behind me, I felt the cold stone of one of the standing monoliths. The entire circle seemed to hum with some sort of energy, and the symbols carved into the stones glowed faintly in the gray light. This was the heart of whatever controlled the forest, the source of the power that transformed visitors into monsters. An idea began to form in my mind. If this stone circle was the source of the creature's power, then maybe it was also their weakness. "You're right," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "I can feel it starting. The hunger. It's been growing since we arrived." The Jake thing tilted its head, studying me with those bright, inhuman eyes. "You're lying." "Am I?" I asked, allowing desperation to creep into my voice. "Look at me. Really look. Don't you see the change beginning?" The creature stepped closer, peering at my face with predatory interest. Around the clearing, the other monsters had stopped their advance, watching this exchange with anticipation. "Perhaps," the Jake thing said slowly, "the forest does work quickly on some people, especially those who are already hungry for something they can't name." I let my shoulders slump in defeat, playing the part of someone succumbing to whatever force had changed the others. "Show me," I whispered. "Show me how to stop fighting it." The creature's smile became genuinely pleased, the first emotion I'd seen from it that seemed authentic rather than performed. "Touch the stones," it said, gesturing to the monolith behind me. "Let the forest in. Stop resisting what you're becoming." I turned toward the stone as if in a trance, placing my palms against its cold surface. The moment my skin made contact, I felt it. A presence, vast and hungry and utterly alien, pressing against my mind. It wanted in. It wanted to hollow me out and fill the empty space with something that thought only of feeding and hunting and the sweet taste of human fear. But I also felt something else through that connection, the source of the creature's power and its limitations. The forest's influence was strong here, at the stone circle, but it grew weaker with distance. The monsters it created were bound to this place, unable to venture far from their source of power, and the power had a weakness. It needed willing vessels. It could influence and corrupt, but it couldn't simply take control. The people who'd become monsters had chosen transformation, even if they hadn't understood what they were choosing at the time. "Yes," the Jake thing hissed behind me. "Let it in. Let it show you what you really are." Instead of surrendering, I pushed back against the alien presence with all my strength. I thought of my real brother, the Jake who'd laughed at my compass troubles, who'd worried about the strange atmosphere of the forest, who'd dozed peacefully by our campfire before something stole his face and voice. I held on to every memory of his genuine smile, his warmth, his humanity. The presence recoiled, and I felt a crack appear in the stone beneath my palms. "What are you doing?" the creature snarled, no longer bothering with Jake's voice. Its words came out as a grinding rasp that hurt to hear. I pressed harder against the stone, pouring all my love for my brother and my rage at what had been done to him into that connection. The crack widened, and light began to seep through, not the gray, filtered light of the fog-shrouded forest, but genuine sunlight. "Stop him!" the creature howled, and I heard the other monsters rushing toward the stone circle. But I was already pushing with everything I had, and the stone was splitting apart like an eggshell. Brilliant light poured through the widening fissures, and the alien presence shrieked as it was forced back. The other stones in the circle began to crack as well, their supernatural energy discharged in blinding flashes. The creature's screams filled the air as the light touched them. I saw them writhing and changing, their stolen human features melting away to reveal something far worse underneath. Skeletal frames wrapped in shadow, with eyes like burning coals and mouths full of needle-sharp teeth. But as the light grew brighter, even these monstrous forms began to dissolve. Whatever they had become, they couldn't exist without the power of the stone circle to sustain them. One by one, they faded into nothing, their screams dopplering away into silence. The Jake thing was the last to go, clinging to its stolen shape even as the light ate away at its edges. For just a moment, I thought I saw my real brother's face looking out from behind the creature's mask, confused and frightened, but undeniably human. "Mike," he said in his own voice, "what happened to me?" Then the light consumed him too, and he was gone. When the brightness faded, I found myself alone in a perfectly ordinary forest clearing. The stone circle had crumbled to rubble, and the carved symbols on the surrounding trees had vanished. Even the fog had lifted, revealing a clear October afternoon and a path that led unmistakably back toward the lake. Tommy was unconscious but breathing, with no sign of serious injury. I managed to wake him and help him to his feet, though he remained groggy and confused about what had happened. "Where's Jake?" he asked, looking around the empty clearing. I told him Jake had wandered off during the night and that we'd been unable to find him despite hours of searching. It wasn't exactly a lie. The real Jake had disappeared, even if something else had worn his face for a while. We packed up our gear and hiked back to the lake, following a clear trail that seemed to have been there all along. Our canoe was where we'd left it, and our phones worked perfectly once we got within range of the cell towers. The GPS showed our exact location, and the compass pointed steadily north. The official search for Jake lasted 3 days and involved rangers, volunteers, and search dogs. They found no trace of him, and eventually the case was classified as a missing person incident, one of dozens that occurred in Minnesota's wilderness areas every year. I never told anyone what really happened in that clearing. Who would believe such a story? Instead, I let people assume that Jake had suffered some kind of accident or gotten lost in the vast wilderness. It was easier than trying to explain the truth. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder about the other missing people, the hikers and campers who vanished in remote areas and were never found. I wonder how many of them stumbled across places like that clearing, and how many were strong enough to resist what they found there. And sometimes, I wonder if I really destroyed the source of the forest's power, or if I just damaged it temporarily. The thought keeps me awake, staring at my bedroom ceiling and listening to every small sound outside my window. Because I can still feel it sometimes. A small, persistent hunger that no amount of food can satisfy. A whisper in the back of my mind that says the forest is still out there, still waiting, still calling me home. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, near the remote shores of Knife Lake in northeastern Minnesota, during what was supposed to be a healing retreat with my closest friends. The invitation had come at the perfect time. 3 months after my divorce was finalized, after the sleepless nights and the constant questioning of every decision I'd ever made, my college roommate Jessica called with a proposition that felt like salvation, wrapped in pine needles and campfire smoke. "You need this, Sarah," she'd said, her voice crackling through my phone as I sat in my empty apartment, surrounded by boxes I still hadn't unpacked. Just the 4 of us, like old times. No cell service, no internet, no reminders of anything. Just us and the wilderness. The us she referred to included Jessica Davis, my former roommate and eternal optimist who worked as a pediatric nurse, Amanda Wright, our sharp-tongued friend from the journalism program who now wrote for a travel magazine, and Michelle Young, the quiet artist who'd somehow managed to stay grounded through all our collective chaos. We'd been inseparable in college, but life had scattered us across different states and different lives. This trip was meant to reconnect us, to remind us who we were before mortgages and marriages and the weight of adult disappointment. I should have known something was wrong from the moment we met at the Outfitters in Ely. The elderly man behind the counter, weathered and gnarled like the ancient pines that surrounded his shop, had given us a look that lingered too long when we mentioned Knife Lake. "You girls sure about that location?" he'd asked, his fingers drumming against the wooden counter. "Plenty of other lakes just as pretty, maybe more. Welcoming." Jessica had laughed it off with her characteristic brightness. "We're experienced campers, sir. We can handle whatever nature throws at us." The old man's expression had shifted then, something unreadable crossing his features like a shadow passing over water. "It ain't nature you need to worry about out there," he'd muttered, but when Amanda pressed him for details, he'd just shaken his head and finished loading our gear. The paddle to our campsite took most of the afternoon. The September air carried the crisp promise of autumn, and the maples were just beginning to blush red around their edges. The rhythm of our paddles cutting through the dark water was hypnotic, almost meditative. We'd chosen a remote site on the northeastern shore of Knife Lake, accessible only by water and far from the more popular camping areas. As we rounded the final bend and our destination came into view, I felt a strange chill that had nothing to do with the wind coming off the water. The campsite sat on a small peninsula, surrounded by towering white pines that seemed to lean inward, creating a natural amphitheater of shadows. The trees were old, ancient really, their trunks thick as cars and their crowns lost in a canopy so dense it filtered the late afternoon sunlight into a sickly green glow. "It's perfect," Michelle whispered, her artist's eye taking in the cathedral-like quality of the space. But I noticed how her voice seemed to die just a few feet from her lips, swallowed by the oppressive stillness of the place. We made camp efficiently, our years of friendship allowing us to work in comfortable synchronization. Jessica and Amanda set up the tents while Michelle and I gathered firewood and prepared the campsite. By the time the sun began to set, we had a cheerful fire crackling and our gear organized with military precision. It was during dinner that I first noticed the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of wilderness, I was used to that. This was something else entirely, an absence so complete it felt like a weight pressing down on us. No bird calls, no rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, no splash of fish rising to feed in the twilight. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the very air was holding its breath. "Is it just me?" Amanda said, poking at her camp stove with a fork. "Or is it eerily quiet out here?" "I was thinking the same thing," I admitted. "Where are all the loons? You can't spend a night in the Boundary Waters without hearing loons." Michelle looked up from her sketch pad where she'd been drawing the twisted silhouettes of the pine trees. "Maybe they migrate through here earlier in the season." But Jessica, ever the pragmatist, was already consulting her wildlife guide by flashlight. "Says here loons are active well into October. We should be hearing them." We tried to shake off the unease with wine and stories, reminiscing about college adventures and catching up on the details of our increasingly separate lives. But the silence pressed against us like a living thing, making our voices sound too loud and too hollow at the same time. It was past midnight when I first heard the whispering. I'd been lying in my sleeping bag, sharing a tent with Jessica, listening to her steady breathing and trying to convince myself that the odd quality of the darkness outside was just my imagination. The blackness beyond our tent walls seemed too complete, too solid, as if we were surrounded not by forest but by something dense and hungry. The sound started so softly I almost convinced myself it was the wind. A susurrus of voices, too indistinct to make out words but too organized to be natural. It seemed to come from the pine trees themselves, as if the ancient wood was finally giving voice to decades of accumulated secrets. I lay perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs, and strained to listen. The whispering ebbed and flowed like a tide, sometimes rising to an almost audible murmur, sometimes fading to the barest suggestion of sound. But it was constant, relentless, like a conversation being held just beyond the edge of comprehension. "Jess," I whispered, reaching over to shake my tentmate's shoulder. "Jessica, are you awake?" She mumbled something incoherent and rolled over, clearly deep in sleep. I considered waking her anyway, but what would I say? That I was hearing voices in the trees. After months of therapy and antidepressants following my divorce, I was acutely aware of how fragile my mental state appeared to others. The last thing I wanted was to worry my friends or, worse, have them think I was having some kind of breakdown. So I lay there in the darkness, listening to the trees whisper secrets I couldn't understand, and told myself it would all seem normal in the morning. I was wrong. Dawn came reluctantly, filtered through the dense canopy in weak gray streams that seemed to bring more shadow than light. I emerged from my tent feeling like I hadn't slept at all, my body aching and my mind foggy with exhaustion. The whispering had continued until just before sunrise, only fading as the first pale light began to seep through the pine needles. The others were already awake, moving around the campsite with the same sluggish quality I felt in my own limbs. None of us had slept well, judging by the dark circles under everyone's eyes and the way we all kept glancing up at the trees with expressions of vague unease. "Coffee," Amanda declared, her usually sharp wit dulled by fatigue. "I need coffee before I can process whatever the hell kind of night that was." "Bad dreams?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual as I helped Jessica rekindle the fire. "Not dreams exactly," Michelle said slowly, her artist's sensitivity always making her more attuned to atmospheres and moods. "More like..." I kept feeling like someone was watching us, like there were eyes in the darkness. "I heard things," Jessica admitted reluctantly. "Voices, maybe. But whenever I really tried to listen, they'd stop." My relief at learning I wasn't the only one who'd experienced something unusual was quickly overshadowed by a deeper concern. If we'd all heard the whispering, then what exactly had we stumbled into? "Maybe it's just the isolation getting to us," Amanda suggested, but her journalist's training made her sound skeptical of her own explanation. First night in the wilderness, unfamiliar sounds, our minds filling in the blanks. We might have convinced ourselves she was right if not for what happened next. I was washing our breakfast dishes at the water's edge when I saw the reflection. At first, I thought it was just the play of light on the dark surface of the lake, but as I stared, the image became unmistakably clear. A face, pale and drawn, with hollow eyes that seemed to look directly at me. But when I spun around to see who was behind me, there was nothing but empty forest. My hands were shaking as I dipped the last plate into the cold water, and when I looked down again, the reflection was gone. But the memory of those hollow eyes lingered, boring into my consciousness like splinters of ice. "We should explore today," Jessica announced with forced cheerfulness when I returned to camp. "There are supposed to be some really interesting rock formations on the other side of the peninsula." Anything was better than staying in camp with the oppressive weight of those ancient pines pressing down on us, so we packed day packs with water and snacks and set off through the forest. The lack of underbrush made walking easy, but it also created an eerie, cathedral-like quality to the woods. Our footsteps echoed strangely in the vast spaces between the massive tree trunks, and more than once I caught myself looking over my shoulder, convinced someone was following us. The rock formations Jessica had mentioned turned out to be a series of granite outcroppings that jutted from the forest floor like the bones of some buried giant. They were beautiful in their way, carved by millennia of wind and weather into smooth organic curves that seemed almost intentional. Michelle immediately began sketching while the rest of us explored, climbing over the sun-warmed stone and enjoying the first real sunlight we'd experienced since arriving. It was Amanda who found the cave. "Hey, come look at this," she called from behind a particularly large boulder. When we joined her, she was peering into a cleft in the rock that opened into darkness. "It goes back pretty far. Anyone have a flashlight?" The opening was narrow but tall enough for us to enter upright. Jessica produced a small LED flashlight from her pack, and we squeezed through the entrance one by one. The cave was larger inside than it appeared from outside, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadow above our heads and walls that curved away into multiple passages. But it was the smell that made me want to leave immediately. It wasn't the expected mustiness of damp stone or the organic decay of forest floor. This was something else entirely, sweet and cloying, with an underlying note of corruption that made my stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. It was the smell of something that had been beautiful once but had gone wrong, turned rotten at its core. "God, what is that stench?" Amanda gagged, covering her nose with her shirt. "Dead animal, maybe," Jessica suggested, but she was already backing toward the entrance. "Something big." Michelle was standing perfectly still in the center of the cave, her head tilted as if listening. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. We all froze, straining our ears. At first, there was nothing but the sound of our own breathing and the distant drip of water on stone. But then, so faint it might have been imagination, came the whisper of voices. The same indistinct murmuring I'd heard in the night, but clearer here, more focused. "We need to leave," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "Now." No one argued. We scrambled toward the entrance with unseemly haste, not caring how it looked or what we might be running from. The relief of emerging into clean forest air was overwhelming, and we stood there for several minutes, breathing deeply and not quite meeting each other's eyes. "That was probably just wind through the rock formations," Jessica said finally, but she made no move to go back and investigate. "Probably," Amanda agreed, though she was already shouldering her pack. "Should we head back to camp?" The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower through the trees, and none of us wanted to be caught in the forest after dark. We made our way back to camp in relative silence, each lost in our own thoughts and trying to rationalize what we'd experienced. It was only later, as we sat around the rebuilt fire sharing a dinner of camp stew and crusty bread, that Michelle spoke up about what she'd been sketching all day. "I need to show you something," she said, pulling out her sketch pad with obvious reluctance. "I don't understand it, but I can't stop drawing them." She opened the pad to a page filled with faces, dozens of them, covering every inch of paper in overlapping profiles and full portraits. They were skillfully drawn, each one distinct and individual, but they all shared the same hollow-eyed expression I'd seen in the lake's reflection. Men and women, young and old, all with that same look of desperate hunger. "I didn't mean to draw them," Michelle continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I sat down to sketch the rock formations, but my hand just... These are what came out, page after page of them. She flipped through the sketch pad, revealing more of the same. Faces emerging from tree bark, peering from between rocks, floating in empty space with expressions of profound longing. The skill was undeniable. These weren't random doodles, but carefully observed portraits. But portraits of what? Or whom? "Maybe they're just subconscious impressions," Amanda suggested weakly. "Artists are supposed to be more sensitive to atmosphere and mood, right? You're probably just picking up on the creepy vibe of this place." But as night fell and the whispering began again, we all knew there was more to it than that. This time, the voices were louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from all around us, rising from the ground beneath our feet and falling from the branches above our heads. And now, straining to listen in the flickering light of our campfire, I could almost make out words. "Join us," they seemed to be saying. "Stay with us. Become us." "You all hear that, right?" Jessica's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "Please tell me you all hear that." We huddled closer to the fire, though its light seemed pitifully small against the vast darkness that pressed in on us from all sides. The ancient pines loomed over us like watchful sentinels, their massive trunks disappearing into shadow that seemed deeper and more solid than mere absence of light. "We should leave," I said. "First thing in the morning, we pack up and paddle out of here." "Absolutely," Amanda agreed immediately. "This place is seriously messed up." But Michelle was staring up at the trees with an expression I didn't like. There was something dreamy about her gaze, something unfocused and distant that reminded me uncomfortably of the hollow-eyed faces in her sketches. "Michelle?" I reached out to touch her arm. "You okay?" She blinked and seemed to come back to herself. "Sorry, I just..." For a second there, I thought I understood what they were saying. "What who was saying?" Jessica demanded. "The voices. They're not threatening us. They're lonely. They've been alone for so long and they just want us to stay, to be part of their family." The way she said it, with such simple conviction, made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. I'd heard that tone before, during the worst days of my marriage when my ex-husband would try to convince me that his increasingly erratic behavior was perfectly reasonable. It was the voice of someone who'd accepted something fundamentally wrong as normal. "Michelle, listen to me," I said carefully. "Whatever you think you're hearing, it's not real. It's just the isolation and the stress and the weird acoustics of this place playing tricks on our minds." She looked at me with pity, the way you'd look at a child who didn't understand something obvious. "Oh, Sarah, they're not tricks. They're invitations." That was when Jessica screamed. We spun around to see her pointing at the edge of our campsite, where the light from our fire met the wall of darkness beyond. A figure stood there, tall and pale, with long hair that seemed to move independently of any wind. As we watched in frozen horror, it stepped forward into the circle of light, and I saw that it wasn't quite human. The proportions were wrong, somehow. Too tall, too thin, with arms that hung just a little too long and fingers that seemed to have too many joints. Its face was beautiful in the way that ice sculptures are beautiful. Perfect features carved from something cold and lifeless. But it was the eyes that made my sanity wobble on its foundations. They were holes, not just empty but actively dark, as if they led somewhere deeper than skull and brain. "Welcome," it said, and its voice was the whisper of wind through dead leaves. "We've been waiting for you." Amanda was fumbling for something in her pack. Pepper spray, maybe, or a knife, but her hands were shaking too badly to find anything useful. Jessica had gone completely rigid, her scream dying in her throat as if the very air had been sucked from her lungs. But Michelle was stepping forward, toward the thing that wore a human shape like an ill-fitting costume. "I know you," she whispered. "I've been drawing you." "And we know you," the creature replied. "Artist, creator, you understand the beauty in darkness, the truth that others refuse to see." I lunged forward and grabbed Michelle's arm, trying to pull her back toward the fire, but she resisted with surprising strength, her muscles tensing as if she were fighting not just me but her own basic survival instincts. "Let me go, Sarah," she said, and her voice had that same dreamy quality I'd noticed earlier. "They're not going to hurt us. They just want us to stay." "Michelle, that thing is not human," I hissed, still trying to drag her away from the creature that watched our struggle with those terrible hollow eyes. "Whatever it's promising you, it's lying." But she twisted out of my grip with inhuman flexibility, her joints bending in ways that made my stomach lurch. As I watched in horror, her face began to change, her features sharpening and elongating until she looked more like the thing at the edge of our camp than the friend I'd known for over a decade. "The invitation has been accepted," the creature said with something that might have been satisfaction. "The artist will join our family." That's when I realized the voices we'd been hearing weren't coming from the trees or the wind or any natural phenomenon. They were coming from people, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, who had found this place over the years and chosen to stay. The faces in Michelle's sketches weren't products of her imagination. They were portraits of the lost, the ones who had heard the whispers and decided that eternal loneliness was better than the pain of the living world. "Run!" I whispered to Jessica and Amanda. "Run now!" But when I turned to see if they'd heard me, Jessica was gone. Amanda was still there, crouched by the fire with her pepper spray finally in her hand, but her eyes were scanning the darkness frantically. "Where is she?" she demanded. "Where did Jessica go?" I spun in a complete circle, searching the shadows beyond our fire for any sign of movement. The creature and Michelle had vanished as well, leaving us alone with the whispering darkness and the growing certainty that we were no longer the hunters in this scenario. We were prey. "Jessica!" I called, my voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. "Jessica, where are you?" The answer came from above us. "I'm here," she called back, but her voice was wrong. Too high, too musical, like wind chimes made of human vocal cords. "I'm right here." We looked up to see her perched impossibly in the crown of one of the massive pines, at least 60 feet above the ground. She was sitting casually on a branch that shouldn't have been able to support human weight, her legs swinging gently back and forth like a child on a playground swing. "Jessica, how did you get up there?" Amanda shouted. "How are you going to get down?" "I don't want to come down," Jessica replied, and even from that distance I could see that her smile was too wide, showing too many teeth. "It's beautiful up here. You can see everything, all the families that have joined them over the years. They're all so happy now. I grabbed Amanda's arm. We have to go. Now. Leave everything and run for the canoes. But Amanda was staring up at Jessica with the same dreamy expression I'd seen on Michelle's face. Maybe she's right, she murmured. Maybe they are happy. Maybe that's what we've been missing. A real family. People who will never leave us or hurt us or disappoint us. Amanda, listen to yourself. I shook her hard, trying to break through whatever influence was working on her mind. These things aren't people. They're parasites, or demons, or something worse. They're feeding on our loneliness and desperation. She looked at me with pity, the same expression Michelle had worn just before she'd transformed. Oh, Sarah, you're so angry, so hurt. When did you become so afraid of love? I let go of her arm and backed away, my heart hammering so hard I was surprised it didn't crack my ribs. All around me, the darkness was full of movement, shapes that might have been human once, gliding between the ancient tree trunks with fluid grace. The whispers had grown louder, more distinct, and now I could make out individual voices among the chorus. My mother's voice, telling me I was pretty enough if I just tried harder. My ex-husband's voice, explaining why everything that went wrong was somehow my fault. The voice of my college advisor, suggesting that maybe I wasn't cut out for the career I'd dreamed of. Every doubt, every criticism, every moment of self-loathing I'd ever experienced was being echoed back to me by the creatures in the darkness. You've always been alone, they whispered. Always been rejected. Always been not quite enough. But here you can belong. Here you can be perfect. For just a moment, I wavered. The offer was so tempting. The promise of an end to the constant ache of disappointment and inadequacy that had been my companion for so long. What was waiting for me back in the real world anyway? An empty apartment, a job that barely paid the bills, a social media feed full of other people's happiness that only highlighted my own isolation. But then I remembered the smell in the cave. That sweet corruption that spoke of beauty turned rotten at its core. Whatever these creatures were offering, it wasn't love or belonging or any of the things they promised. It was just another kind of death, wrapped in pretty lies and false comfort. I turned and ran. Behind me, I could hear Amanda calling my name, her voice already taking on that musical, inhuman quality that marked the beginning of her transformation. But I didn't look back. I crashed through the forest like a madwoman, my flashlight beam dancing wildly ahead of me as I stumbled over roots and crashed through low-hanging branches. The creatures followed, of course. I could hear them moving through the trees with their impossible grace, sometimes ahead of me, sometimes behind, always just at the edge of my vision. They didn't seem to be in any hurry to catch me. This was a game to them, a hunt they could end whenever they chose. But I had one advantage they didn't expect: rage. Not the cold, bitter anger I'd carried since my divorce, but something hot and fierce and protective. These things had taken my friends, my family, the people who mattered most to me in the world. They'd twisted their minds and stolen their humanity, and that was unforgivable. I reached the shore of the lake just as the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the canopy. Our canoes were still pulled up on the rocky beach where we'd left them, and I dragged one into the water with strength I didn't know I possessed. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the paddle, but I managed to push off from shore and begin stroking toward the open water. That's when I saw them gathered on the beach behind me. Michelle, Jessica, and Amanda stood side by side at the water's edge, their faces pale and perfect in the growing light. But their eyes were holes, empty spaces that led to infinite darkness, and when they smiled at me, their teeth were too sharp and too numerous. "Sarah," they called in unison, their voices harmonizing in ways human voices shouldn't be able to harmonize. "Come back to us. We're your family. We love you." I paddled harder, my shoulders burning with the effort, but the canoe seemed to be moving through thick syrup instead of water. The lake stretched endlessly in all directions, and I began to realize that distance might not matter to these creatures. If they could make Jessica appear 60 feet up in a tree, If they could transform my friends into hollow-eyed puppets, then what was a mile or two of open water? But as the sun climbed higher, something changed. The whispers that had been my constant companion since arriving at this cursed place began to fade, and the oppressive weight of the forest's attention lifted from my shoulders. When I looked back, the beach was empty. My friends, or the things wearing their faces, had vanished with the darkness. I paddled for 3 hours straight, my arms screaming and my back on fire, until I reached the outfitter's dock in Ely. The elderly man who'd warned us about Knife Lake was there, as if he'd been waiting for me. He helped me out of the canoe without asking questions, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders and pressing a cup of hot coffee into my shaking hands. "Where are the others?" he asked gently. "Gone," I whispered. "They're gone." He nodded as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. "The Pines have been hungry for a long time," he said. "Every few years, someone comes back alone. Always just one, never more." "What are they?" I asked. "The things in the trees?" "Old," he replied. "Older than the forests. Older than the lakes. They've been calling to the lonely and the lost for centuries, offering them what they think they want most: family, belonging, an end to pain. But it's not real. Real enough for those who accept it. Your friends made their choice, miss, same as all the others who came before them. The Pines don't take anyone who doesn't invite them in." I wanted to argue, to insist that my friends had been coerced, that they'd been victims of some kind of supernatural predation. But I remembered the expressions on their faces. Not fear or confusion, but recognition, relief. They'd found what they'd been looking for, even if it wasn't what they'd expected to find. The authorities searched, of course. I led them back to our campsite, though it took 3 tries to find it again. The forest seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking, rearranging itself to hide its secrets. We found our abandoned camp exactly as I'd left it, with 3 untouched sleeping bags and the remnants of our last fire. But there was no sign of my friends. No trace of their passage except for Michelle's sketchpad lying open beside the dead coals. The faces she'd drawn were different now. Instead of the hollow-eyed hunger I remembered, they looked peaceful, content, almost happy. And there, on the last page she'd worked on, were 3 new portraits: Jessica, Amanda, and Michelle herself. Their features subtly altered but unmistakably them. They were smiling. I kept the sketchpad. I don't know why. Maybe because it was the only proof I had that my friends had existed, that our friendship had meant something before the Pines claimed them. Or maybe because looking at their transformed faces reminded me of something important: that loneliness is not cured by surrendering your humanity to something that promises easy answers. It's been 6 months now since I returned from Knife Lake. Since, I've moved to a new city, started a new job, begun the slow process of building a life that doesn't revolve around the emptiness left by divorce and disappointment. I still have bad days, times when the whispers of my own inadequacy seem louder than the sounds of the living world. But when those moments come, I remember the sweet corruption I smelled in that cave, and I choose the messy, painful reality of being human over the hollow perfection of belonging to something that feeds on despair. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing through the trees outside my apartment, I think I can hear them calling. My friends' voices, harmonizing with that ancient chorus, promising me that there's still a place for me in their impossible family. The invitation, they whisper, remains open. But I've learned to recognize the difference between loneliness and hunger, between genuine connection and the counterfeit comfort offered by things that wear human faces but have forgotten what it means to be human. My friends made their choice in that dark forest, drawn by promises that felt more real than the uncertainty of life itself. I made a different choice. And every morning when I wake up alone in my small apartment, every evening when I come home to silence and solitude, I make that choice again, to be human, with all the pain and disappointment that entails. To be real, even when reality is harder than the alternatives. The whispering pines are still out there, in the deep places where the old things wait for the lonely and the lost. They're patient. They have all the time in the world. But I have something they don't understand, something they can't replicate no matter how perfectly they mimic human voices or human faces. The stubborn, contradictory, gloriously imperfect will to keep living, keep trying, keep hoping for something better than the beautiful lies they offer. And that, I've learned, is enough. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness near Kabetogama State Forest in northern Minnesota, where the ancient pines grow so thick they swallow sound itself. I should have listened to my gut when Sarah Rodriguez suggested the camping trip. We'd been friends since college, bonded over late-night study sessions and too much coffee, but lately our friendship had felt strained. Sarah worked in marketing for a tech company downtown, always buried in her phone, always chasing the next promotion. I taught elementary school and treasured my summers off, but this year felt different, empty. My divorce had been finalized 3 months earlier, and the silence in my apartment had become unbearable. "You need this, Jen," Sarah had insisted, spreading topographical maps across my kitchen table. "Just you, me, and nature. No cell towers, no ex-husbands, no bullshit. Pure wilderness therapy." The irony wasn't lost on me that she'd chosen one of the most isolated areas in Minnesota. Kabetogama State Forest stretched for miles of unbroken wilderness, dotted with hidden lakes and crossed by game trails that hadn't seen human footprints in decades. The nearest town, International Falls, was 40 miles away through winding forest roads that became impassable during heavy rains. We'd planned to hike to Ghost Lake, a name that should have been our first warning. Local folklore claimed it was cursed, that the Ojibwe had considered it a place where the veil between worlds grew thin. But Sarah had laughed off the stories, calling them tourist trap nonsense. She'd found the location through some outdoor adventure blog, complete with GPS coordinates and a detailed trail description. The drive up had been pleasant enough. We'd taken Sarah's Honda CR-V, loaded with enough gear for a week, though we'd only planned 4 days. Sarah had insisted on bringing her expensive camping equipment, a 4-season tent, sleeping bags rated for sub-zero temperatures, a portable water filtration system that looked like it belonged on a space station. "Better to over-prepare," she'd said, though something in her voice had sounded forced, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. The last cell tower had been 30 miles back. My phone showed no signal, and when I'd mentioned it, Sarah had quickly shut hers off too. Digital detox, remember? We'd parked at the trailhead just after noon. The Forest Service sign was weathered and partially obscured by overgrown vegetation. Ghost Lake Trail, 8.2 miles, experienced hikers only. Below it, someone had carved crude letters into the wood. "Turn back." "Charming," I'd muttered, adjusting my pack straps. The trail started wide and well-maintained, winding through stands of towering white pines and paper birch. Shafts of sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating a cathedral-like atmosphere that should have been peaceful. Instead, I felt watched. The sensation crawled up my spine like cold fingers, making me glance over my shoulder every few minutes. Sarah noticed my unease. "You're being paranoid. It's just the quiet getting to you." But it wasn't quiet. Not really. There were sounds, subtle wrongness that set my teeth on edge, bird calls that didn't quite match any species I knew, rustling in the underbrush that followed our footsteps too precisely, and underneath it all, a low humming that might have been insects or might have been something else entirely. 3 miles in, the trail began to narrow. The GPS on Sarah's watch started acting erratically, the arrow spinning in slow circles before finally giving up and displaying an error message. She'd laughed it off, pulling out a paper map and compass. Old-school navigation. More authentic, anyway. But the map didn't match what we were seeing. According to the topographical lines, we should have been walking along a ridge, but the ground beneath our feet was consistently level. The trail markers became sporadic, then disappeared entirely. "We must have taken a wrong turn," I said, stopping to examine the map over Sarah's shoulder. "Impossible. There's only been one trail." She was right, but that made it worse. We'd been walking for 4 hours on what should have been a straightforward path, and nothing looked familiar. The trees seemed older here, their trunks wider and more gnarled. Spanish moss hung from branches like funeral shrouds, though I was pretty sure Spanish moss didn't grow this far north. "Sarah, I think we should head back." "We're fine. Look, there's water ahead." Through the trees, I could see the glint of sunlight on water. But as we approached, my stomach dropped. This wasn't the clear mountain lake from the blog photos. This was a stagnant pond, maybe 50 feet across, choked with algae and fallen logs. The water was black as tar, and the smell hit us like a physical blow. Decay and sulfur and something else I couldn't identify but made my mouth water with nausea. "This can't be Ghost Lake," I whispered. Sarah was staring at her phone, jabbing at the screen with increasing frustration. Nothing. No GPS, no signal, nothing. How is that even possible? The sun was starting to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked like blood seeping through bandages. The smart thing would have been to turn back immediately, but we both knew we'd never make it to the car before dark. The trail had twisted and branched so many times I wasn't even sure which direction led home. "We camp here tonight," Sarah decided. "First light, we follow our footprints back." I wanted to argue, but the alternative was stumbling through unknown wilderness in the dark. We set up camp on a small clearing about 100 yards from the putrid lake, though even at that distance the smell lingered. Sarah's expensive tent went up easily, and we managed to get a fire started using some dry pine needles and deadfall. As darkness fell, the wrongness intensified. The fire burned with an odd blue-green tinge that cast sickly shadows on the surrounding trees. Our headlamps worked, but the beams seemed weaker than they should have been, as if the darkness was actively fighting back. "Tell me about Marcus," Sarah said suddenly. The question caught me off guard. Marcus was my ex-husband, and Sarah knew the divorce had been messy. "Why?" "Just trying to distract us both. You never really told me what happened." I poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks spiral up into the canopy. "He was having an affair with his dental hygienist, if you can believe the cliché." "How did you find out?" There was something odd in her voice, an intensity that made me look at her across the flames. Her face was partially hidden in shadow, but her eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's. "I came home early from a faculty meeting, found them in our bed." "That must have been devastating." "It was." I hesitated, then decided to tell her the whole truth. But you know what the worst part was? I wasn't even surprised. I'd known something was wrong for months. The late nights, the phone calls he'd take in another room, the way he'd stopped looking at me during conversations. I'd been living with a stranger and pretending everything was fine. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "Sometimes we see what we want to see, even when the truth is right in front of us." A log shifted in the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. In the brief flare of light, I could have sworn Sarah's face looked different, sharper somehow, with angles that hadn't been there before. But when I blinked, she looked normal again. "I'm going to check the perimeter," she said, standing and grabbing her flashlight. "Sarah, don't wander off. Just a quick look around. Stay by the fire." She disappeared into the darkness beyond the circle of firelight, leaving me alone with the crackling flames and the oppressive silence of the forest. Minutes passed. Then I heard her voice, faint and distant. "Jennifer, come here. You need to see this." Every instinct screamed at me not to leave the fire, but Sarah sounded excited rather than afraid. I grabbed my headlamp and followed the sound of her voice, pushing through underbrush that seemed to grab at my clothes with thorny fingers. "Sarah, where are you?" "Over here." Her voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing strangely in the close air. I stumbled forward, my light beam dancing across tree trunks that all looked identical in the darkness. Branches whipped at my face, and more than once I had to stop and untangle myself from what felt like spider webs but looked like nothing in my flashlight beam. "Sarah!" Silence. I spun in a slow circle, trying to get my bearings, but every direction looked the same. Panic started as a flutter in my chest and quickly spread through my entire body. I was lost, maybe 50 yards from camp, and I had no idea which way led back to the fire. Then I heard her laughing. It was Sarah's laugh, but wrong somehow. Too high, too long, with an edge that made my skin crawl. It seemed to come from above, and when I tilted my head back, I saw a figure in the canopy about 20 feet up, perched on a thick branch like some kind of predatory bird. "Sarah, how did you get up there?" The figure dropped to the ground with impossible grace, landing in a crouch that no human spine should have been able to manage. In the wavering beam of my headlamp, it looked like Sarah. Same height, same build, same dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. But when it straightened and turned toward me, the face was all wrong. The features were sharper, more angular, as if someone had taken Sarah's face and stretched it over a different skull. The eyes were too large and reflected light like a cat's. And the smile, God, that smile stretched too wide, revealing teeth that were too pointed and too numerous. "Found you," it said in Sarah's voice. I ran. Branches tore at my clothes and face as I crashed through the underbrush, my headlamp beam bouncing wildly. Behind me, I could hear it following, not running, but moving through the forest with the fluid grace of something that belonged there, something that had never been human at all. I burst into our campsite, gasping and bleeding from a dozen scratches. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, casting everything in a hellish red light. And sitting beside the dying flames, staring into her phone, was Sarah. "Jesus, Jen, you look like you've seen a ghost. Where have you been?" I stood there panting, trying to process what I was seeing. This was Sarah. I was sure of it. The right proportions, the right face, even the small scar on her chin from a childhood accident. But I'd just seen her in the trees, or something, wearing her face. "I was looking for you," I gasped. "You called me, told me to come see something." Sarah looked up from her phone with genuine confusion. "I've been here the whole time. My phone finally got a signal, so I've been trying to call for help." I stared at the device in her hands. The screen was black, dead. "Sarah, your phone doesn't have a signal. We haven't had service for hours." She looked down at the phone, then back at me. For just a moment, her expression was completely blank, as if she was trying to remember something important, but couldn't quite grasp it. "Right," she said finally. I must have been dreaming. I dozed off by the fire. But she hadn't been asleep when I'd left. She'd been wide awake, talking about checking the perimeter. And there was something else, something that made my blood run cold. When I'd left to follow her voice into the forest, the fire had been burning bright. Now it was nearly dead, reduced to coals that would have taken hours to burn down that far. How long had I been gone? I checked my watch, but the display was dark. The digital face showed nothing but black pixels, though I'd replaced the battery just last month. Sarah's expensive outdoor watch was similarly dead, its face cracked as if it had been smashed against a rock. "We need to leave," I said, "right now." "Jen, it's the middle of the night. We can't navigate in the dark." "Something's wrong here. That thing I saw—" "What thing?" The way she asked made me pause. There was genuine concern in her voice, but also something else. Something calculating. She was watching me too intently, studying my reaction with the focus of a predator evaluating prey. "Nothing," I said carefully. "I think I'm just tired." We spent the rest of the night huddled in the tent, taking turns keeping watch. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear sounds outside. Footsteps circling our campsite, the rustle of something large moving through the underbrush, voices calling our names from the darkness. But when I'd peer through the tent flaps, there was nothing but empty forest. Sarah seemed to sleep peacefully, but twice I caught her eyes open, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. And once, I could have sworn I saw her lips moving silently, as if she was having a conversation with someone I couldn't see. Dawn came slowly, filtered through the thick canopy until the forest was bathed in sickly green light. The smell from the lake was stronger now, so powerful it made my eyes water. When I crawled out of the tent to relieve myself, I discovered something that made my blood freeze. Our footprints from the previous day were gone, not covered by leaves or washed away by rain, simply gone, as if we'd never walked that ground at all. But leading away from our campsite, heading deeper into the forest, was a single set of prints. They looked like Sarah's hiking boots, but the stride was wrong, too long, with the toes pointed inward in a way that suggested joints that bent differently than human ones should. "Sarah," I called softly, "you need to see this." She emerged from the tent, stretching and yawning like someone who'd slept peacefully. "What is it?" I pointed to the prints. "Do you remember walking that way?" She studied the tracks with the same calculating expression I'd noticed the night before. "No, but maybe I was sleepwalking? I used to do that as a kid when I was stressed." It was possible, but the prints were too perfect, too deliberate. They looked like someone had walked that path with absolute confidence, knowing exactly where they were going. We broke camp in silence, stuffing our gear into packs with shaking hands. The forest felt different in daylight, not safer, but more oppressive. The trees seemed to press closer, and every shadow looked like it might be hiding something. Birds should have been singing, but the only sounds were our own breathing and the distant buzz of insects. The trail back should have been obvious. We'd only come from one direction. But nothing looked familiar. Every tree, every rock formation, every bend in the path seemed alien. It was as if the forest had rearranged itself overnight, creating new paths and hiding familiar landmarks. After 2 hours of hiking, we stopped at what should have been a recognizable ridgeline. According to our map, we should have been able to see the parking area from here, or at least the road cut through the trees. Instead, the forest stretched endlessly in every direction, an unbroken canopy of green that rolled toward the horizon like a vast ocean. "This is impossible," Sarah muttered, turning the map this way and that. "We should be able to see something. Power lines, roads, anything." I was studying the compass, watching the needle spin lazily instead of pointing north. "Sarah, what if we're not lost?" "What do you mean? What if we never left?" She looked at me with something that might have been pity. "Jen, you're starting to sound paranoid." But I wasn't being paranoid. I was starting to understand. The weird timeline, the impossible geography, the way nothing made sense. We weren't lost in the normal sense. We were somewhere else entirely, somewhere that looked like Minnesota but operated by different rules. That's when I noticed the trees. Every pine tree we passed had the same pattern of scars on its bark, 3 parallel gouges about 8 feet up the trunk, as if something with very large claws had marked its territory. The marks were fresh, with sap still oozing from the cuts. And they were all the same height, made by the same creature. Something big enough to reach 8 feet up a tree trunk. Something with claws. "Sarah," I whispered, pointing to the nearest scarred tree. She followed my gaze and went very still. "Those weren't there yesterday." Yes, they were. I just didn't notice them. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. These marks were new, made sometime during the night while we'd been sleeping. Or trying to sleep. The sap was still wet, still fragrant with the smell of pine and something else, something musky and predatory that made my hindbrain scream warnings about apex predators and ancient fears. We started walking faster, but the marked trees seemed to multiply. Every trunk bore the same 3 parallel scars, and they were getting fresher. Some were so new the bark was still falling away in long strips, fluttering to the ground like wounded birds. That's when we heard the breathing. It was deep and slow, coming from somewhere above us. I looked up and saw something that made my knees buckle. Perched in the canopy, about 30 feet up, was a creature that might have been human once but had been stretched and twisted into something else entirely. Its limbs were too long, its torso elongated like taffy pulled to the breaking point. The skin was pale and mottled, and when it turned its head to look down at us, I saw that its face was a horrible amalgamation of human and animal features. But the worst part was the smile. It was Sarah's smile, stretched across a mouth that was too wide and filled with too many teeth. "Run!" I breathed. We ran. The thing followed us through the canopy, moving from tree to tree with spider-like agility. I could hear it above us, the crack of branches, the whisper of something large displacing air, the occasional thud as it leaped from trunk to trunk. It was hurting us, I realized, driving us deeper into the forest, away from any hope of finding our way back to the real world. Sarah stumbled and went down hard, her pack spilling open across the forest floor. I turned back to help her, and that's when I saw her face clearly for the first time since we'd started running. It wasn't quite right. The proportions were off by millimeters. Eyes slightly too far apart, nose a fraction too narrow, lips that didn't quite match the curve I remembered. It was close enough to fool a casual observer, but when you really looked, when you paid attention, the wrongness was undeniable. "Jennifer," it said in Sarah's voice, "help me up." I backed away slowly. "What did you do with her?" "I don't know what you mean." But its expression was too blank, too perfect, like a mask that had been carefully crafted but lacked the subtle imperfections that made a face real. "Where is Sarah?" It tilted its head at an angle that was just slightly too far to be human. "I am Sarah." "No, you're not." The thing that looked like Sarah smiled, and for a moment its face flickered like a television with bad reception. I caught a glimpse of something underneath. Angular features, pale skin, eyes that reflected light like mirrors. Then the Sarah mask snapped back into place. "You're being paranoid again," it said, "just like with Marcus." "I never told you about Marcus." Its smile widened, showing teeth that were definitely not Sarah's. "You told me by the fire. Don't you remember?" But I did remember, and that was the problem. I told Sarah about my ex-husband, but I'd told the real Sarah. This thing had been listening, learning, storing up details to use against me. Above us, the breathing was getting closer. Whatever was in the trees was descending, and I could smell it now. Wet earth and decay and something that might have been sulfur. The stench was so strong it made my eyes water. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the camping knife from Sarah's spilled pack and held it out in front of me like a talisman. "Stay back." The Sarah thing laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. "You can't hurt me with that, Jennifer. I'm your friend." "My friend is dead, isn't she?" For just a moment, something that might have been sadness flickered across its face. She fought very hard. I admired that about her. The admission hit me like a physical blow. Sarah was gone. Had been gone since sometime yesterday when she'd wandered off to check the perimeter. This thing had been wearing her face, learning her mannerisms, preparing to take her place in the world beyond the forest. "Why?" I whispered. "Because I'm tired of being alone. Do you know how long I've been here? Jennifer? How many years I've spent in this place between places, waiting for someone to stumble into my domain?" The breathing above us had stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I tried to make it quick for her. The thing continued. "But she kept asking about you, even at the end. She was worried you'd blame yourself." Rage flooded through me, hot and clean and sharp. Sarah had been my friend since college. We'd laughed together, cried together, shared secrets and dreams and fears. She'd been planning to be my maid of honor before Marcus ruined everything, and this creature had taken all of that away. I lunged forward with the knife, but the Sarah thing moved faster than anything human should have been able to move. It caught my wrist and twisted, and I heard bones crack. The knife fell from numb fingers. "I didn't want to hurt you," it said sadly. "I was hoping you'd just accept the change. It would have been easier for both of us. Pain shot up my arm from my broken wrist, but I managed to stumble backward. Behind the thing, wearing Sarah's face, I could see movement in the trees. The breathing creature was descending, its elongated limbs wrapping around tree trunks as it made its way down to ground level. "Two of you," I gasped. "There are two of you." "We're pack hunters," the Sarah thing explained. "One to scout, one to hunt. I found you first, so I get to keep your shape. My partner will have to settle for your friends." The other creature hit the ground with a wet thud. Up close, it was even more horrible than I'd imagined. 7 feet tall at least, with skin like wet leather and limbs that seemed to have too many joints. Its face was a shifting kaleidoscope of human features. Sometimes Sarah, sometimes me, sometimes people I didn't recognize. The only constant was the hunger in its eyes. "She's injured," it said in a voice like grinding stone. "This won't take long." I ran again, clutching my broken wrist against my chest. Behind me, I could hear them following. Not hurrying, not concerned about losing me. They knew these woods better than I ever could, knew every trail and hiding place. I was bleeding, injured, and utterly lost. This was just a game to them. But I wasn't ready to die. Not like this. Not here. I crashed through underbrush that tore at my clothes and face, looking for anything that might give me an advantage. A cliff I could climb, a river I could cross, a cave I could hide in. Anything. What I found was worse than anything I could have imagined. In a small clearing about the size of a basketball court, there were bones. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, scattered across the forest floor like the remains of some ancient battlefield. They were human bones. I could tell that much even in my panicked state. Skulls and rib cages and long bones that had been cracked open to get at the marrow inside. Some of the bones were old, weathered, and yellowed with age. Others looked fresh, still bearing traces of dried flesh. And, lying among the older remains, I saw pieces of modern clothing. A hiking boot, a smartphone case, a backpack that looked depressingly familiar. This was their larder, their feeding ground. For decades, maybe centuries, they'd been luring people into these woods and adding their bones to the collection. I was going to be next. "Jennifer." The voice was Sarah's, calling from the edge of the clearing. But I knew it wasn't really her. Sarah was dead, somewhere in this boneyard, her remains scattered among the countless others who'd been unlucky enough to stumble into this pocket of hell. "I know you're scared," the thing wearing her face called out, "but running just makes it worse. Let us help you." Help, as if death was a kindness they were offering. I crouched behind the largest pile of bones, trying to make myself small, trying to think. The knife was gone, my wrist was broken, and I was trapped in a clearing with nowhere to run. But I wasn't dead yet, and as long as I was alive, I had a chance. The creatures entered the clearing from opposite sides, moving with the coordinated precision of pack hunters. In the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy, I could see them clearly for the first time. The Sarah thing looked almost normal from a distance, but up close the wrongness was undeniable. Its proportions were slightly off, its movements too fluid, its smile too wide. And the other one, God, the other one was an abomination that hurt to look at directly. "We can smell you," the tall one said in its grinding voice. Fear has such a distinctive scent. They were circling the bone pile now, closing in like wolves around wounded prey. I had maybe 30 seconds before they reached me. That's when I remembered something from my childhood, something my grandfather had told me about the old ways, the stories the Ojibwe used to tell about creatures like these. Shapeshifters and skinwalkers and things that lived in the spaces between the real world and the spirit realm. Iron, he'd said. Cold iron could hurt them, could drive them back to wherever they'd come from. I dug frantically through the bones around me, looking for anything metal, a belt buckle, a wedding ring, anything. My fingers closed around something cold and sharp, a camping knife, probably dropped by one of their previous victims. The blade was rusty and pitted, but it was steel. It would have to do. The Sarah thing was almost close enough to touch when I sprang up from behind the bone pile, slashing wildly with the rusty knife. The blade caught it across the cheek, and it screamed. Not with Sarah's voice, but with a sound like tearing metal that made my teeth ache. Black ichor poured from the wound, and for a moment the thing's face flickered and wavered like heat mirage. I saw what was underneath, something pale and angular with too many teeth and eyes like black holes. "Iron," it hissed, stumbling backward. "She has iron." The tall creature snarled and lunged at me, but I was ready. I slashed at its reaching claws and felt the blade bite deep. More of that black blood sprayed across the clearing, and the thing let out a howl that made birds explode from the trees in every direction. But there were two of them and only one of me, and they were learning to stay out of reach of my improvised weapon. They began circling again, more cautiously this time, waiting for me to tire or make a mistake. I couldn't fight them forever. My broken wrist was screaming with pain and I was already exhausted from running. But I had to try. For Sarah, for all the people whose bones littered this clearing, for everyone who might stumble into this nightmare after me. The tall creature feinted left, then darted right, trying to get behind me. I spun to face it, swinging the knife in a wild arc that missed by inches. The Sarah thing took advantage of my turned back and leaped forward, its fingers extended into claws that looked like they could tear through steel. I dropped to one knee and thrust the knife upward, feeling it punch through something soft and vital. The creature's momentum carried it forward, driving the blade deeper, and suddenly I was pinned under its weight as black blood poured over my hands and arms. It was still wearing Sarah's face, but the features were shifting and melting like wax in a furnace. For just a moment, I saw my friend's real face underneath the mask. Peaceful, almost grateful. "Thank you," she whispered with her own voice. Then the light went out of her eyes and the body began to dissolve, turning into something that looked like black smoke and smelled like sulfur. The tall creature howled again, a sound of rage and loss that echoed through the forest like thunder. It charged at me with no regard for the iron blade, accepting the wounds I managed to inflict in exchange for getting its claws around my throat. We went down together, rolling through the scattered bones while it tried to crush my windpipe, and I tried to find a vital organ with my knife. Its strength was inhuman, but it was hurt and angry and making mistakes. When it reared back to deliver a killing blow, I managed to drive the rusty blade up through its ribcage and into what I hoped was its heart. For a moment, everything went still. The creature stared down at me with those mirror eyes, and I saw something that might have been surprise. Then it toppled sideways and began to dissolve just like its partner, leaving behind nothing but the smell of decay and a wet stain on the forest floor. I lay there among the bones for a long time, clutching my broken wrist and trying to process what had happened. Sarah was dead. I was alone in a forest that might not even be part of the real world, and I had no idea how to get home. But I was alive. Somehow, impossibly, I was alive. Eventually, I forced myself to stand and look around the clearing more carefully. Among the scattered remains, I found other things. Watches and jewelry and electronic devices that looked like they'd been there for years. But I also found something else. A trail of disturbed earth leading away from the clearing, as if something heavy had been dragged through the forest. I followed it. The trail led to another small clearing, this one containing something that made my heart leap with desperate hope. It was Sarah, the real Sarah, tied to a tree and unconscious but breathing. Her face was pale and streaked with dirt, but she was alive. "Sarah!" I shook her gently and her eyes fluttered open. "Jen? Oh God, Jen, we have to get out of here. There are things in these woods, things that can—" "I know. I killed them." She stared at me in disbelief, taking in my torn clothes and blood-covered hands. Both of them. Both of them. Getting Sarah untied with a broken wrist was agony, but eventually we managed it. She was weak and dehydrated, but she could walk. Together, we stumbled through the forest, following what we hoped was the right direction. We found the trail just as the sun was setting. The real trail, marked with blazes and signs that looked blessedly familiar. 3 hours later, we stumbled into the parking lot where Sarah's Honda sat exactly where we'd left it. The drive back to International Falls passed in mostly silence. What was there to say? We'd survived something that shouldn't have existed, killed creatures that weren't supposed to be real. Sarah called the police from the first gas station with cell service. But how do you explain that you were attacked by shape-shifting monsters? We settled for reporting that we'd gotten lost and found evidence of missing persons. The bones in the clearing would speak for themselves. That was 6 months ago. Sarah moved to California shortly afterward, saying she needed a change of scenery. We still talk sometimes, but the conversations are stilted and awkward. We're both trying to pretend that what happened in the Kabetogama State Forest was just a shared hallucination, brought on by stress and isolation. But I know better. Sometimes, late at night, I dream about that clearing full of bones. I dream about the thing that wore Sarah's face and the horrible truth it told me about being alone. And sometimes in those dreams, I wonder if I really killed both of them. Because lately, I've been noticing things. Small things, the way shadows fall at odd angles in my apartment, the way my reflection in the bathroom mirror sometimes seems to move a fraction of a second too late. The way my neighbors have started looking at me with something that might be fear, and sometimes when I'm not paying attention, I catch myself smiling Sarah's smile, the one that's just a little too wide with teeth that are just a little too sharp. Maybe I didn't kill them both. Maybe one of them followed me home.